I'll never forget the moment my mother whispered those words to my fiancé 2 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. Choose her instead. My younger daughter, she's stronger, smarter, better for you. Trust me. I was hiding behind the church door wedding dress already on when I heard it. My mother, the woman who raised me, selling me out like yesterday's leftovers. And Marcus, the man I'd loved for 4 years, he didn't even hesitate. At the altar, I stood completely alone, 300 guests staring at me with pity, while my sister walked in wearing my backup dress, holding my bouquet, stealing my future. My mother smiled from the front row, like she'd just orchestrated the wedding of the century. I walked out of that church and disappeared. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone. 10 years of silence. 10 years of building myself into someone they wouldn't recognize. So when I sent them invitations to my homecoming celebration at a 5-star hotel, they came running curious, maybe guilty, definitely unprepared for what I'd become. The ballroom went dead silent when I walked in. Designer gown, diamond necklace, confidence they'd never seen before. But that wasn't what made my mother's champagne glass slip from her trembling fingers. That wasn't what made my sister grab Marcus's arm in sudden panic. That wasn't what made 300 guests gasp in unison. It was the man who walked in behind me. My husband. The man whose face made my family freeze in absolute terror. Because my husband wasn't just successful. He wasn't just powerful. My husband was the one person they never wanted to see again. And tonight, every betrayal they'd buried was about to be dug up and served ice cold. Stay with me. You won't believe what I've been planning for 10 years. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years planning other people's perfect days. As a wedding planner, I've orchestrated everything from intimate backyard ceremonies to million-dollar extravaganzas, and I pride myself on one thing above all else: attention to detail. I notice everything: the slight tremor in a bride's hand before she walks down the aisle, the way a groom's mother's smile doesn't quite reach her eyes, the single wilted rose in an otherwise flawless centerpiece. That skill, that curse of seeing what others miss, has made me excellent at my job. It's also made me acutely aware of every moment my own family has tried to diminish me. The restaurant I'd chosen for our Thanksgiving dinner was called Belmont's, one of those establishments where the chandeliers cost more than most people's cars, and the waitstaff glide across marble floors like ballet dancers. I'd reserved the private dining room overlooking the downtown skyline, paid the $10,000 deposit without blinking, and even specified the menu myself. Herb-crusted turkey with cognac gravy, truffle mashed potatoes, roasted Brussels sprouts with pancetta, and a pumpkin creme brulee that the chef assured me would be unforgettable. I wanted this dinner to be perfect. I wanted just once for my family to gather without tension, without the subtle jabs and comparisons that had colored every holiday since I was a child. Luke sat beside me in the back seat of the car as my driver navigated through the evening traffic, his 12-year-old fingers drumming nervously against his knee. He'd worn the navy blazer I'd bought him for the occasion, and he'd even let me fix his hair without complaint, though one stubborn cowlick was already rebelling. "Mom," he said quietly, "do I have to sit next to Aunt Valerie?" The question broke my heart. He'd learned to fear these family gatherings the same way I once had. "You'll sit next to me," I promised, squeezing his hand. The whole time. When we arrived, the maitre d' greeted us with the kind of professional warmth that comes from recognizing a generous tipper. I'd worked with Belmonts on several client events, and they knew me well. As we walked through the main dining room toward our private space, I noticed the usual Thursday evening crowd: men in expensive suits discussing business over rare steaks, women with perfect hair laughing over wine, the kind of people who belonged in places like this. I'd fought hard to become one of them to earn my seat at tables like these, but tonight I was about to be reminded that some people will never let you forget where you started. The private dining room was exactly as I'd requested: soft lighting, fresh white orchids, as the centerpiece place cards in elegant calligraphy. My father Richard was already there, looking distinguished in his gray suit, his silver hair immaculately styled. Beside him sat Beverly, his partner of 3 years, a pleasant-faced woman in her early 60s, who always seemed slightly uncomfortable around the rest of us. Then there was Valerie, my older sister, dripping in jewelry that her husband Kurt's questionable business dealings had purchased. Kurt himself lounged in his chair like he owned the place, already working on what appeared to be his second scotch. "Evelyn," my father said, standing to greet me with a brief, awkward hug that felt more like a business transaction. "You've outdone yourself with this venue. Must have cost a fortune." "It's Thanksgiving," I replied, simply helping Luke into his seat. "Family should be together." As an event planner, I have a habit that served me well over the years I document important gatherings. Before we sat down, I'd quietly informed the restaurant manager that I'd be recording our dinner for family memories, a perfectly legal practice in Texas where only one party needs to consent. I set my phone in its discreet holder near my place, setting the camera angled to capture the table. Call it professional instinct. Call it self-protection. Call it whatever you want. I've learned that memories fade, but recordings don't lie. The first course arrived, a delicate butternut squash soup with sage oil, and the conversation started pleasantly enough. Beverly asked Luke about school. Richard mentioned a recent golf game. Valerie complimented the restaurant, though I noticed the way her eyes lingered on the prices listed in gold leaf on the menu. Everything was fine until the main course arrived, and with it the knives came out. "So, Luke," Valerie said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she cut into her turkey, "has Evelyn told you about your real parents yet? Or is she still pretending you're actually hers?" The table went quiet. Luke's fork froze halfway to his mouth. I felt my spine straighten automatically, that old defense mechanism kicking in. "Valerie," Beverly said softly, "perhaps we could talk about something else." But Valerie was just getting started. She'd had 3 glasses of wine already, I'd been counting, and the alcohol had loosened whatever thin filter she normally maintained. "I mean, let's be honest. You're adopted, sweetheart. That's nothing to be ashamed of, but facts are facts. You're not really part of this family. Not by blood." She paused, letting that poison sink in before delivering her final blow with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So your son only deserves leftovers, really. The scraps. Not the good stuff we're having." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. I watched Luke's face crumple, watched him try so hard not to cry, watched his hand instinctively reach for mine under the table. Around us, I could sense other diners in nearby rooms pausing their conversations, that universal human instinct to eavesdrop on drama. My father, the man who'd raised me, who'd walked me down the aisle at my wedding, who'd held Luke as a baby and called him grandson. My father laughed. Actually, laughed. "She's got a point, Evelyn. You should have just packed the boy something cheap from home. Why waste the good food?" Beverly's face flushed red. "That's enough," she said, but her voice was too quiet, too weak. She didn't have the power here, and everyone knew it. I looked at my family, at Valerie's smug expression, at Kurt's amused smirk, at my father's casual cruelty, at Beverly's ineffectual discomfort, and something inside me went very still and very cold. This was who they were. This was who they'd always been, and I was done pretending otherwise. "Noted," I said calmly, my voice steady even as my jaw tightened. I continued eating my turkey, took a sip of water, and waited. When the server brought the final bill, $10,000 for the deposit, I'd already paid plus $186.42 for Luke's and my meals. I stood with the grace I'd learned from years of navigating high society events. I opened my wallet, pulled out my credit card, and handed it to the server along with a generous tip. "I'll be paying for 2 seats at this table," I announced clearly. "Mine and my son's. That comes to $187.40. The rest of you can handle your own portions." The server, bless him, understood immediately. He processed my card without comment, while Valerie's face flushed crimson and my father began to sputter. "Evelyn, you can't be serious. I paid for 2 seats at this table," I repeated, collecting my purse and helping Luke out of his chair. The rest of you can handle your own portions. Enjoy your Thanksgiving." I took Luke's hand and walked toward the exit. My head high, my steps measured. Behind me, I could hear the explosion beginning Valerie's shrill protests, Richard's demands, Kurt's cursing. But I didn't turn around. I'd spent 46 years turning around, trying to earn their approval, trying to be good enough. I was done turning around. We'd just reached the restaurant lobby when a server I didn't recognize approached me, an older woman with kind eyes. She pressed something into my hand, a sealed envelope. The paper yellowed with age, the edges soft from years of handling. "This was left for you," she said quietly. "Years ago. The instructions were very specific to give it to you when your family forgot who you are." I looked down at the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, achingly familiar, impossible. My mother had been dead for 3 years, but there in her distinctive script were the words, "For Evelyn, when they forget who you are." My hands trembled as I clutched it to my chest, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family, about my history, about who I was about to change. I barely made it through the restaurant's front doors before I heard Valerie's heels clicking rapidly across the pavement behind me. My driver was already pulling the car around, but she was faster, her voice carrying across the parking lot like a siren. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her carefully applied makeup now smeared from what I assumed were tears of rage rather than remorse. "You humiliated us in there. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" Everyone was staring. I kept walking, one hand gripping the envelope, the other holding Luke's trembling fingers. My son was trying so hard to be brave, but I could feel the tension radiating from his small body. "Evelyn, stop!" Valerie grabbed my arm, spinning me around. Her breath reeked of wine and desperation. "You can't just walk away from family like this. We're blood. You have obligations." Before I could respond, Kurt materialized beside her. His face flushed that particular shade of red that comes from expensive scotch and unchecked entitlement. "You know what you just did in there? That's actionable. Public humiliation, breach of verbal contract. My attorney's going to have a field day with this." I looked at him calmly, years of dealing with difficult clients having taught me exactly how to handle bullies. "Your attorney is welcome to explain to a judge why 4 adults expected one person to pay for a $10,000 dinner after they publicly mocked her 12-year-old child. I'm sure that will go very well for you." "You're not even real family." My father's voice boomed across the parking lot. He'd followed them out, his face contorted with an anger I'd seen too many times in my childhood. "Your mother took pity on you, gave you everything, and this is how you repay her memory, by abandoning us over some harmless jokes." Something inside me snapped. "Harmless," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You told my son he deserves scraps. You laughed about it. If that's harmless to you, Dad, then I'm glad I'm not real family." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Behind him, I noticed Beverly standing near his Mercedes, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold despite the mild Texas evening. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, concern, maybe? Or was it something else? Something that looked almost like understanding or even protection. But the moment passed too quickly for me to be sure, and honestly, I was too angry and hurt to care about whatever complicated emotions Richard's girlfriend might be feeling. My driver pulled up and I guided Luke toward the car. As I opened the door, Luke looked up at me with those wide brown eyes that had captured my heart the moment I'd first held him as a 3-year-old in the foster care office. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking, "do I really not deserve the same food as them because I'm adopted?" I dropped to my knees right there on the asphalt, not caring about my dress, or the audience still gathered behind me. I took both of his hands in mine and looked directly into his eyes. "You deserve the whole feast, sweetheart. Never forget that. Not just the food, everything. The love, the respect, the dignity. All of it. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong." He nodded, a tear sliding down his cheek, and I pulled him into a fierce hug before helping him into the car. As we drove away, I could see Valerie still gesticulating wildly in the rearview mirror, but her voice had finally faded into the night. The drive home felt endless. Luke fell asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from the emotional warfare, while I clutched my mother's envelope like a lifeline. The moment we got home, I carried him upstairs, tucked him into bed, still wearing his blazer, and kissed his forehead. Then I went to my study, poured myself a glass of wine I had no intention of drinking, and sat down at my desk with shaking hands. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I slid my finger under the seal carefully, reverently, as if the yellowed paper might disintegrate at too rough a touch. Inside was a single recipe card, the kind my mother used to keep in her wooden box in the kitchen. Grandmother's Kindness Soup. The title read in my mother's flowing handwriting. But as I examined it more closely, I realized something was off. The ingredient measurements had tiny numbers penciled in the margins, numbers that made no sense for a recipe. 2 tablespoons of compassion, but the margin note said 340 K. 3 cups of patience with RH trustee override, written beside it. I turned the card over, and there in my mother's handwriting was a message that made my breath catch. When they serve you cruelty, remember where you came from. The truth lies in the cedar chest at the old house. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Start with the recipe book. Mom. The old house. I hadn't been there since her funeral 3 years ago. After she died, Richard had insisted on keeping it in the family, though he'd never actually moved back in. It just sat there, a shrine to a marriage I'd always thought was happy, but was now beginning to suspect had been something else entirely. I was still staring at the recipe card, trying to decode what the margin notes meant, when my phone chimed with an email notification. The sender was Harrison & Locke, LLP, one of the most expensive law firms in Dallas. The subject line read, Re-emergency petition for fund management review. My stomach dropped as I opened it. The email was formal, cold, and devastatingly clear. Richard, as co-trustee of the Eleanor Hart Community Services Fund, the charity my mother had established before her death and left in both our names, was filing an emergency petition to freeze all fund activity. The petition cited concerning behavior and potential mental instability demonstrated by Ms. Hart's erratic financial decisions and volatile emotional state. And as evidence, they referenced tonight's dinner, claiming my refusal to pay constituted irrational financial judgment and inability to honor commitments. The fund had $340,000 in it, money meant for foster care support, domestic violence shelters, and youth programs. Money that helped kids like Luke, and Richard was trying to take it away from me because I wouldn't let him abuse my son. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from today. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone when I called Gwen. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. Evelyn, what's wrong? I told her everything, the dinner, the letter, the petition. She was silent for a long moment after I finished. They're serious, she said finally, her voice grim in a way I'd never heard before. If they convince a judge you're unstable, you could lose everything, including custody of Luke. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like hours before Gwen continued, her attorney voice taking over. Okay, listen to me carefully. In Texas, co-trustees can petition the court to remove the other trustee for incompetence or breach of fiduciary duty. What Richard's lawyers are doing is painting tonight's dinner as evidence of poor judgment, erratic behavior, inability to honor financial commitments, emotional instability. It's a weak case, honestly. Any reasonable judge will see through it. But, I pressed because I could hear the hesitation in her voice. But family court judges can be unpredictable, especially in smaller jurisdictions. If Richard gets in front of the right judge and tells a convincing story about his unstable daughter who abandoned her family at a public dinner, who's raising an adopted son in what he'll call a volatile environment. Evelyn, we need to be prepared for anything. We have 2 weeks to build an airtight defense. I closed my eyes, fighting back the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. What do I need to do? Come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring every financial record related to the fund, any documentation of your involvement with the charity, character references, everything. And Evelyn... She paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. There's something else. Your mother left a sealed letter with our firm 3 years ago right before she died. The instructions were very specific, to be opened only if Evelyn faces legal action from her family. I've been holding it all this time waiting. I think it's time you read it. After we hung up, I sat in my study staring at the recipe card until the words blurred together. The margin note's 340K trustee override suddenly made horrible sense. My mother had known. Somehow she'd known this would happen. She'd left me breadcrumbs, a trail to follow, but I needed to understand where it led. The next morning, I woke Luke early and told him we were taking a road trip. We're going on a treasure hunt, I explained, keeping my voice light despite the knot of anxiety in my stomach. To Grandma's old house. There are things there she wanted me to find, things about our family history. His eyes lit up with the kind of curiosity that only 12-year-olds possess, the resilience of youth already bouncing back from last night's cruelty. Like pirates. Something like that, I said, kissing the top of his head. Get dressed. We leave in 20 minutes. The drive to my childhood home took 3 hours, heading east into the rolling hills of small-town Texas. As the city skyline faded in my rearview mirror and the landscape opened into sprawling ranches and pine forests, memories I'd worked hard to bury began surfacing like bodies in a flood. I remembered being 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while Valerie showed off her spelling test 100% as always. My mother had smiled and said, "Well done, sweetheart," and then my father had looked at my 92% and sighed. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" he'd asked. Not unkindly, but with a disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. I remembered being 11, overhearing Valerie tell her friends at my birthday party that I was the charity case, that my parents had picked me up from the market like a lost puppy. When I'd run crying to my mother, she'd held me close and whispered the words that became my mantra. "Kindness is the only weapon you'll ever need, my darling. Remember that." I remembered being 16, making the honor roll for the first time, so proud I could barely contain myself. Valerie had made cheerleading captain that same week. Guess which achievement got celebrated at dinner? The girl they picked up from the market. That phrase had haunted me through childhood, through my teens, through my early 20s, when I was building my business and trying so desperately to prove I belonged. I'd always assumed it was just Valerie's cruelty, her way of establishing dominance. But what if there was truth buried in those taunts? What if my mother's letter and that recipe card were pointing towards something I'd been too afraid to see? Luke slept in the passenger seat as we drove through the town limits of Hartsville, population 3847. The town square looked exactly as I remembered the old courthouse, the diner with its faded red awning, the hardware store that had been there since the 1950s. My mother had grown up here, had never really left, even after she married Richard and moved to Dallas for his career. She'd kept the house visited every month, maintained it like a shrine to something I'd never fully understood. The property management company had left a key for me as requested. The house stood at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and flower beds that were now overgrown with weeds. I told Luke to wait in the car while I went inside, not wanting him to see me fall apart if this search turned up nothing. The air inside was stale thick with dust and the particular silence of abandonment. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, each step creaking beneath my weight, and found the cedar chest exactly where my mother had said it would be, tucked beneath the eaves covered with an old quilt. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. The smell of cedar and old paper wafted out, and there, carefully organized in the way only my mother could manage, was my past laid bare. The leather-bound recipe book sat on top, filled with her handwriting and those strange margin notes. Beneath it, a stack of love letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Legal documents in a sealed manila folder marked "For Evelyn's Eyes Only" in her careful script. And then I saw it, the birth certificate. Not the one I'd used my whole life, the one that listed Richard Hart as my father. This one was different, older, the paper more fragile. Mother's name, Eleanor Catherine Hartwell. Father's name, James Nathaniel Hart. James Nathaniel Hart. Not Richard. The room spun slightly as I tried to process what I was seeing. A yellow sticky note was affixed to the certificate, and I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. "You were never adopted, darling. You were always mine. Richard married me when you were 2, but your real father was the love of my life. He died before you were born. His family founded this town." I sat back on my heels, the birth certificate trembling in my hands. Richard wasn't my father. Had never been my father. Every comparison, every disappointment, every time he'd made me feel less than he'd had no right. No claim to me except the one my mother had given him when she'd married him in what I now understood must have been desperation or loneliness, or some combination of both. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Your mother wasn't the only one who knew the truth. Be careful who you trust. A friend." I stared at the text message for a long moment, my mind racing through possibilities. Who else knew? Who was watching? But I couldn't afford to spiral into paranoia right now. I had a chest full of secrets in front of me, and 2 weeks to understand what my mother had been trying to tell me. I set my phone aside and reached for the sealed manila folder marked, "For Evelyn's Eyes Only." The folder's metal clasp was stiff from years of disuse, but it finally gave way. Inside were documents that had been organized with the kind of meticulous care my mother brought to everything important. The first page was a legal brief from a law firm I didn't recognize, dated just 3 months before her death. As I read, my hands began to shake so violently I had to set the papers on the floor to continue. The brief confirmed what the birth certificate suggested: I was the biological daughter of James Nathaniel Hart, a man whose name appeared on half the historical plaques in Hartsville. But he wasn't just some local figure. According to the property deeds and trust documents in the folder, the Hart family had owned substantial land holdings throughout the county, including the entire lakefront property that bordered the town, over 200 acres of pristine waterfront that was apparently worth millions. I found a trust document dated 2 weeks after my birth. James Nathaniel Hart had established it before his death, leaving everything to "my child or children to be administered until said child reaches the age of 45, at which time full disclosure and control shall transfer to the beneficiary." I was 46 now. Someone had kept this information from me for an entire year after I should have been told. The correspondence between my mother and her attorney painted a disturbing picture. Letter after letter detailed Richard's attempts to position himself as a family representative to various developers interested in the lakefront property. He'd been telling people he had authority to negotiate on behalf of the Hart estate. He'd been attending town council meetings, making deals, accepting what the lawyers carefully termed consulting fees that looked an awful lot like bribes. And all of this had started ramping up in the months after my mother's death, when the person who actually knew the truth couldn't contradict him anymore. One letter from the attorney to my mother, dated 8 months before she died, stood out. "Eleanor, I must advise you again to tell Evelyn the truth about her heritage before Richard's machinations cause irreparable harm. He's gotten Kurt involved now. Your son-in-law has formed a shell company that's negotiating with Dallas developers. They're planning to sell the lakefront for resort development. If they succeed before Evelyn knows her rights, the legal battle to undo it will be catastrophic." My mother had known. She'd known Richard was using her, using our family name, using everything she'd built to line his own pockets. And she'd been trying to protect me, to give me the weapons I'd need to fight back, but she'd run out of time. I set the legal documents aside and picked up the leather-bound recipe book, the one my mother had mentioned in her note. It was beautiful, the kind of thing you'd see in an antique store, hand-stitched, binding, cream-colored pages that had yellowed slightly with age. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, but as I flipped through the pages, something felt wrong. The recipes themselves were normal enough: Sunday pot roast, Eleanor's apple pie, Christmas morning casserole, but the margins were filled with notations that made no sense in a culinary context. Next to a recipe for truth cake, my mother had written, "When you bake with honesty, the numbers always add up." Below that were strings of numbers and initials, RH 87,000, KC 45,000, TBD LLC 340,000. I flipped to another page, a recipe for justice served cold, and found more dates. Dollar amounts, initials I didn't recognize. Some entries had tiny asterisks next to them, others had question marks. My event planning business had required enough bookkeeping that I recognized what I was looking at. These weren't recipe notes. They were financial records. My mother had been documenting transactions, tracking money, recording evidence in a place no one would ever think to look. A recipe book was domestic, feminine, dismissible, the perfect hiding place for proof of financial crimes. I pulled out my phone and began photographing every page, making sure to capture the margin notes clearly. Whatever my mother had uncovered, whatever Richard and Kurt had been doing, she'd preserved the evidence. I just needed to figure out how to decode it completely. I was so absorbed in photographing the recipes that when my phone rang, I nearly dropped it. The screen showed an unknown number with a local area code. For a moment, I considered not answering that text message had made me wary of unknown contacts, but something made me hit the accept button. Evelyn. The voice was female, hesitant, familiar. "This is Beverly. Please don't hang up." Beverly, Richard's partner, the woman who'd sat at Thanksgiving dinner and watched my family tear me apart with only a weak "that's enough" in my defense. I should have ended the call immediately, but curiosity kept my finger away from the disconnect button. "I need to meet with you," she continued, speaking quickly as if afraid I'd interrupt. "Alone, tonight. There are things about your mother and about Richard that you need to know before that court hearing. Things I should have told you years ago." "Why would you help me?" I asked, my voice cold. "You're with Richard." "I'm at the Lakeview Diner," she said, ignoring my question. "Please come. I know you have no reason to trust me, but your mother did. That has to count for something." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's secret life, holding a phone that had just delivered its second cryptic message of the day. Beverly had been at that dinner. She'd seen what they did to Luke. She'd done nothing to stop it. And now she wanted to meet. But my mother had trusted her. Somehow, according to Beverly's strange claim, my mother had trusted this woman who was supposedly Richard's partner. Nothing made sense anymore. I packed the cedar chest's contents carefully into a canvas bag, carried it down to the car where Luke was playing games on his tablet, and drove to the Lakeview Diner on the outskirts of town. The diner was one of those timeless establishments that looked like it hadn't changed since 1975. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the smell of coffee and pie perpetually hanging in the air. Beverly sat in the back booth exactly as she'd said she would be. She looked different than she had at Thanksgiving, smaller somehow, nervous, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. When she saw me, relief flooded her face quickly, followed by something that looked like fear. I slid into the booth across from her, keeping my expression neutral, my guard firmly in place. Beverly didn't waste time with pleasantries. She reached into her purse, pulled out a manila folder, and slid it across the Formica table. Then she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, and said the words that would change everything I thought I knew. "Your mother hired me 2 years before she died. Everything Richard thinks I am, it's a lie." I stared at Beverly across the diner table, trying to reconcile this nervous woman with the polished, composed figure who'd sat beside Richard at Thanksgiving. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "My mother hired you to pretend to be Richard's girlfriend." "For 2 years." Beverly nodded, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. "We were friends in college, your mother and I. Lost touch for decades the way people do until she tracked me down 3 years ago. She'd just been diagnosed with a terminal heart condition. The doctors gave her 18 months, maybe 2 years. She didn't want to tell Richard, didn't want him hovering or worse, making decisions about her care. But she knew she had to protect you before she died. Protect me from what? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. From him. From all of them. Beverly opened the manila folder she'd brought and spread several documents across the table between us. Your mother suspected Richard had been positioning himself to benefit from the Hart family estate for years, but she didn't have proof. She needed someone on the inside, someone Richard would never suspect. So she asked me to do something that went against every instinct I had. She asked me to seduce her husband. The words hung in the air between us, shocking in their bluntness. Beverly continued, her voice steady, but her eyes haunted. It wasn't difficult. Richard's ego made him an easy mark. I played the role of the charmed younger woman. I'm 62, but he's 68, and that was enough for him to feel powerful. Within 3 months, he'd asked me to move in with him. Your mother gave me her blessing. She wanted eyes and ears in that house. For 2 years, I said quietly, you've been spying on him. Documenting, Beverly corrected. Everything. Every phone call with Kurt about the lakefront property, every meeting with developers, every conversation about the charity fund, every plan they made to ensure you'd never find out about your real father or your inheritance. She tapped the documents in front of me. I have recordings, Evelyn, 2 years' worth, email chains, financial transfers, witness statements from people Richard thought he could trust to keep their mouths shut. Your mother knew they'd come after you the moment she was gone. She spent her last 2 years building you an armor of truth. I picked up the first document, a printout of an email chain between Richard and Kurt. The subject line read, Hart Lakefront Timeline. As I read, my stomach churned. They were discussing the Hart family lakefront property, the 200 acres my biological father had owned, the land that was apparently held in trust with me as the beneficiary. According to the emails, Richard and Kurt had been meeting with a Dallas development group called Pinnacle Resort Holdings for over 18 months. The property is currently in a trust, Beverly explained, pointing to a legal document in the pile. Your biological father set it up before he died with the land held for his heirs. Your mother was the trustee while you were underage, and it should have transferred to you when you turned 45. But Richard has been telling the developers that he has family authority to approve any sale as your stepfather and as your mother's widower. Can he do that? I asked, feeling the walls closing in. Absolutely not. He has no legal standing whatsoever. But Pinnacle doesn't know that, and Richard's been stringing them along accepting payments he calls consulting fees. The developers want to build a luxury resort condos, a spa, a marina. They'd destroy the community park and public access your father established. The whole point of James Hart's trust was to preserve that land for the town. I flipped through more emails, each one more damning than the last. One from Kurt to Richard, dated just 2 months ago, made my blood run cold. We need to move this before the old lady's daughter figures out who she really is. Once she knows about James Hart, we lose all leverage. The developers are getting impatient. They want the deal done by spring, or they're pulling out. That's $2.3 million in finder's fees we can't afford to lose. Keep the adopted girl focused on her little weddings and that kid. She's too busy to ask questions. The adopted girl, I said, my voice hollow. They've been calling me that this whole time. Beverly reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Your mother saw these emails, Evelyn. I showed them to her before she died. It broke her heart. She said... Beverly's voice caught. She said she wished she'd been brave enough to leave Richard years ago. But she'd been so young when James died, and she had a baby to raise, and Richard seemed safe. By the time she realized what kind of man he really was, you and Valerie were teenagers, and she thought leaving would hurt you more than staying. She regretted that choice every day. I sat back in the booth, overwhelmed by the scope of what Beverly was telling me. My mother had known. She'd known Richard was using her, using our family name, scheming to steal my inheritance. And instead of confronting him directly, she'd orchestrated an elaborate long game to make sure I'd have everything I needed to fight back after she was gone. There's more, Beverly said, pulling out another folder. "The charity fund, the Eleanor Hart Community Services Fund. Richard's been draining it slowly, moving money into accounts he controls, planning to claim administrative expenses. That's why he's trying to get you removed as co-trustee. If the court gives him sole control, that $340,000 disappears within months." I thought about the margin notes in my mother's recipe book, the dollar amounts that matched what Beverly was describing. My mother had been tracking it all, leaving me a paper trail even Richard didn't know existed. That's when the diner door burst open with such force that several customers jumped. Valerie stood in the doorway, her face flushed with rage and what looked like 3 cocktails worth of liquid courage. Behind her was a man in his 30s carrying a professional camera, the kind private investigators used for surveillance. "You!" Valerie shrieked, pointing at me. Then her eyes landed on Beverly, and confusion twisted her features. "You two know each other? What is this? What's going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Beverly stood calmly, her demeanor completely transformed from the nervous woman of moments ago. This was the Beverly who'd spent 2 years playing a role, and she was still acting. "Longer than you've been lying to your sister, Valerie," Beverly said, her voice cool and steady. Valerie's hands were shaking as she held up her phone, shoving it toward me. On the screen was an old photograph, faded and creased, a picture of me as a toddler at what looked like a Hart family gathering. There were people I didn't recognize, a large house in the background, and someone had written on the back in pencil, "Evelyn Hart, age 2, Hart Estate Summer Picnic." "You're going to steal everything!" Valerie screamed, tears now streaming down her face, her voice rising to a pitch that made other diners stare. "The house, the land, the money, it was supposed to be ours. Mom promised Dad he'd be taken care of. But I'll make sure the whole town knows what you are. I'll make sure everyone knows you're just trying to steal from the family that raised you." She turned and ran out of the diner, the man with the camera hurrying after her, snapping photos of me as he went. The silence that followed was deafening. Beverly sank back into the booth, her calm facade cracking. "That was a private investigator," she said grimly. "They're building a case against you, documenting everything you do, trying to paint you as unstable or vindictive or both. We need to move faster than I thought." She looked at me intently, her next words careful and deliberate. "There's one more thing your mother left for you, but we need Gwen to open it legally. It's time." Beverly drove us across town in her aging Honda, taking back roads that wound through residential neighborhoods I vaguely remembered from childhood visits. "There's someone you need to meet first," she'd said after we left the diner. "Someone who knew your father, your real father. She's been waiting a long time to talk to you." We pulled up in front of a modest ranch house with a meticulously maintained garden, roses blooming despite the late November chill. Before Beverly could knock, the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 70s with snow-white hair, pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. "Evelyn Hart," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of recognition. "Lord, you look just like him. Come in, come in. I'm Marge Thompson. I've been waiting 30 years for this conversation." Marge's living room was a museum of Hartsville history. Every wall was covered with framed photographs, newspaper clippings, and historical documents. But it was the pictures that drew me like a magnet, black and white photographs of a man who had my jawline, my nose the same slight arch to my eyebrows that I saw in the mirror every morning. "That's James Nathaniel Hart," Marge said, standing beside me as I stared at a large portrait hanging above her fireplace. "Taken at the dedication of the lakefront park in 1978, about 6 months before he died. He was 32 years old." She handed me a smaller photo, this one showing the same man with his arm around a young woman who was unmistakably my mother. Her belly swollen with pregnancy, both of them laughing at something off camera. "And that's your mama. They were the happiest couple I ever saw." I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. My mother looked radiant, younger than I'd ever known her, her whole face lit up with a joy I'd never seen in any picture from my childhood. "Tell me about him," I whispered. Marge settled into her armchair and began to speak, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd told this story many times in her own mind, but never aloud. James was a community leader in the truest sense. His family founded this town, but he never acted like he was better than anyone. When developers came sniffing around in the 70s wanting to buy up the lakefront and turn it into private estates, James fought them tooth and nail. He had that land put into a public trust, made sure it would stay accessible to all families, not just wealthy ones. He used to say that a town without public spaces was just a collection of houses, not a real community. She pulled out a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings from a folder on her coffee table. Hart Air establishes public lakefront, read one headline from 1978. Another showed James standing with a group of children at the lake's edge, teaching them to fish. He died in a construction accident, Marge continued, her voice softening. There was a new community center being built, and some scaffolding collapsed. He was helping with the work himself, that's the kind of man he was, and he got caught under the debris. Your mama was 7 months pregnant with you. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. She never told me. She couldn't bear to talk about it, Marge said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. Your mama loved him something fierce. When Richard came along about a year after you were born, she married him for stability, for security, for a father for her baby. But she never forgot who you really belonged to. She used to bring you here when you were little, show you the lake, tell you stories about the man who'd made sure every child in town could swim there for free. I don't think you remember those visits. I didn't. But as Marge spoke, fragments of memory stirred the smell of lake water, the feeling of my mother's hand in mine, her voice saying something about your father's gift to the town. I'd always assumed she meant Richard. Marge stood and walked to a desk in the corner, returning with a cardboard box filled with documents. Your mother asked me to keep these safe. Town council records mostly. See, I've been attending every meeting for the past 2 years, ever since your mama told me what Richard and that snake of a son-in-law were planning. She spread papers across her coffee table, meeting minutes, development proposals, public comment records. Kurt's been lobbying hard for the resort development. Shows up every month with new economic projections, job creation, estimates, tax revenue forecasts. He's got about half the council convinced that Hartsville needs this development to survive. The other half wants to preserve the lakefront the way James intended it. What do the people want? I asked. Marge smiled grimly and pulled out a thick stack of papers held together with a clip. Over 300 signatures opposing the development. I've been collecting them for 8 months. But Kurt's been spreading lies, telling people the lakefront is Hart family private property and the public has no legal claim to it. He says the family, meaning Richard, has every right to sell to whoever they want. But that's not true, I said, thinking of the trust documents Beverly had shown me. It's absolutely not true. Marge reached back into her box and pulled out a document protected in a plastic sleeve, the paper inside, so old it had turned brown at the edges. This is James Hart's original deed filed with the county in 1978. Read the language there in the 3rd paragraph. I read aloud, said property shall be held in public trust in perpetuity, accessible to all residents of Hartsville and surrounding communities, to be used for recreation, education, and community gathering, never to be developed for private commercial purposes. In perpetuity, Marge repeated. That means forever. Kurt and Richard have been hiding this document's existence from the town council. They've been telling everyone the deed just says it's Hart family land, period. They're banking on nobody checking the actual records. Before I could respond, there was a knock at Marge's door. Beverly opened it to reveal Gwen, my attorney, looking harried and carrying her ever-present briefcase stuffed with documents. I'm glad I caught you all together, Gwen said, declining Marge's offer of coffee. I just came from a meeting with Richard's legal team. We need to talk about the hearing. My stomach dropped. What happened? They've filed a motion for a psychological evaluation. They're claiming that your behavior at Thanksgiving, walking out, refusing to pay, taking Luke with you, demonstrates emotional instability and poor judgment. They want a court-appointed psychologist to evaluate your fitness to manage the charity fund and, by extension, your fitness as a parent. The words hit me like a physical blow. They're questioning my ability to parent Luke. Not directly, not yet, Gwen said carefully. But it's implied. If they can establish that you're mentally unstable, they can petition for supervised visitation, claim you're providing an unhealthy environment. Evelyn, they're playing hardball. Beverly's face had gone pale. Can they actually do this? They can try, Gwen said. I've already filed our counter-motion with character witnesses. I've got statements from 3 nonprofit directors you work with, all praising your management of the fund over 3 years. Not a single discrepancy in the books, not one questionable decision. Your financial records are impeccable. But, I asked, because there was definitely a but coming. But the judge assigned to this case is Patricia Winters. She's been on the bench for 20 years, and she has a reputation for being very conservative about family values. If Richard shows up playing the concerned father, talking about how worried he is about his unstable daughter and her adopted son, and if he's convincing enough, Judge Winters might rule in his favor temporarily, just to be cautious. How temporarily? Beverly asked. 30 to 90 days pending a full evaluation. But that's 30 to 90 days where Richard has sole control of that fund. And based on what you've shown me today, Beverly, 30 days is all he needs to drain it completely. The hearing is in 5 days, I said, feeling the walls closing in. 5 days to build the strongest case possible, Gwen agreed. She looked at Beverly, then at Marge, then back to me. Whatever evidence you have, whatever witnesses can speak to Richard's character versus yours, we need it all, now. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything Beverly's recordings. Marge's documentation of the town council meetings, the recipe book with its coded financial records, the trust documents about the lakefront property. Gwen photographed, documented, took notes in her rapid shorthand. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Marge's living room. As we prepared to leave, I hugged Marge tightly. Thank you for keeping all of this, for remembering my father. He was a good man, Evelyn. The best. And you're his daughter through and through. She walked us to the door, and as we stepped out onto the porch, I noticed a figure standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadow of the old church. An older woman in a gray coat stood there motionless, holding what looked like a worn leather journal pressed against her chest. Even from this distance, something about her made my breath catch. The way she stood, the tilt of her head, the set of her shoulders, it was achingly, impossibly familiar. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I felt a shock of recognition so profound I actually stepped forward. But before I could call out, before I could move, the woman turned and walked quickly toward the church, disappearing through its heavy wooden doors. Did you see that? I asked Beverly, my voice shaking. See what? I stared at the empty space where the woman had been at the church doors now closed. Nothing, I whispered. I thought I saw someone I knew. But the truth was stranger and more impossible than that. For just a moment in the fading light of a November evening, I could have sworn I was looking at my mother. I couldn't shake the image of that woman in the gray coat as Beverly drove us back to the hotel where Luke and I had been staying. The rational part of my brain knew it was impossible. My mother had been dead for 3 years. I'd been at her funeral. I'd watched them lower her casket into the ground. But something about the way that woman moved, the way she'd looked at me, had burrowed under my skin and wouldn't let go. Luke was quiet in the back seat, staring out the window at the darkening streets of Hartsville. I could feel the weight of unasked questions radiating from him, the way only a mother can sense her child's turmoil. When we got back to our room, I ordered room service for both of us. Comfort food? Nothing fancy, just burgers and fries, and we sat together on the bed while we waited for it to arrive. Mom, Luke said finally, his voice small in a way that made my heart ache. Am I really adopted? Is that why Grandpa and Aunt Valerie treat us different? I'd been dreading this conversation and preparing for it in equal measure. I set down my phone and turned to face him, fully taking both of his hands in mine. Yes, sweetheart. I adopted you when you were 3 years old. Your birth parents loved you very much, but they couldn't take care of you the way you deserved. They made an incredibly brave choice to make sure you'd have a better life." His eyes searched my face, looking for something I couldn't quite identify. "So, I'm not really your son?" "You are absolutely my son," I said fiercely. "Luke, listen to me. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. Your birth parents chose to give you life and then chose to give you a chance at a better one. I chose you the moment I saw you in that foster care office. I chose you when I signed the adoption papers. I chose you every single day since then. That makes our bond even more special because we chose each other." I reached for my purse and pulled out the birth certificate I'd found in the cedar chest, the one that revealed James Nathaniel Hart as my biological father. "See this, I just found this a few days ago. Richard Grandpa isn't my biological father either. My real father died before I was born. My mother married Richard when I was 2 and he raised me, but we're not related by blood, so technically Richard has no more biological claim to me than I have to you." Luke studied the document carefully, his 12-year-old mind working through the implications. "So when Aunt Valerie said I only deserve leftovers because I'm adopted, she was being mean to both of us. She was being mean, period. And here's what you need to understand, Luke, when people try to make you feel less than because of where you came from, it's because they feel small inside. They need to hurt others to feel powerful. But the truth is, you don't deserve leftovers. You deserve the whole feast. Always." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at me with those wise eyes that sometimes made him seem far older than 12. "Then I'm double lucky," he said softly. "Two moms loved me enough to choose me. Your mom chose you, even though your real dad died. And you chose me even though I was just some kid in foster care." The tears came before I could stop them streaming down my face as I pulled him into a fierce embrace. I cried from the sweetness of his words, from the unfairness that this beautiful child had ever been made to feel unwanted, and from the rage that burned in my chest toward Richard and Valerie for trying to diminish him. My son, my choice, my family. By the time Gwen and Beverly arrived an hour later, Luke was settled in the adjoining room watching a movie, and I'd pulled myself together enough to function. We spread everything across the desk and coffee table. Beverly's recordings, Marge's documents, the recipe book photographs, the trust papers, my impeccable financial records from 3 years of managing the charity fund. Gwen worked with the efficiency of a surgeon creating a timeline that told our story in cold, hard facts. On one side, Evelyn Hart's flawless management of the Eleanor Hart Community Services Fund. 0 discrepancies. Every dollar accounted for. Programs expanded families helped transparent quarterly reports filed with the state. On the other side, Richard Hart's suspicious activities. Large cash withdrawals with no documentation. Meetings with Kurt's shell company, Pinnacle Holdings. Emails discussing draining the fund. Recordings where Richard explicitly stated he wanted control of that money once we prove she's unfit. "This is damning," Gwen said, listening to one of Beverly's recordings through headphones. In it, Richard's voice came through clearly. "The fund has $340,000. If I can get Evelyn removed as co-trustee, I can redirect those funds through the foundation restructuring. Kurt's got the paperwork ready. We just need to establish she's not competent to manage it." Beverly had been recording for 2 years, but this conversation was from just 3 weeks ago, right before Thanksgiving. They'd been planning this before they ever humiliated Luke at that dinner. The dinner had been bait designed to provoke a reaction they could use against me. "They wanted you to walk out," Gwen said, reaching the same conclusion. "They wanted you to do something they could call erratic or emotionally unstable. That's why Valerie went after Luke specifically. They knew that would get a response." The realization made me sick. They'd weaponized my love for my son. Gwen spent the next hour coaching me on courtroom demeanor. Judge Winters is old school. She values composure, especially in women. "Richard's going to try to make you angry, try to provoke an emotional reaction. Don't let them make you angry, Evelyn. Stay calm, factual, and let the evidence speak. When they attack your character, you don't defend with emotion, you point to the numbers. the fund's growth, the families helped, the transparent accounting. Judge Winters respects women who maintain composure under pressure, even when they're being attacked. I practiced my testimony while Beverly played devil's advocate, throwing the kinds of accusations I knew Richard's lawyers would use. Isn't it true you abandoned your family at a public dinner? Doesn't refusing to pay for your elderly father's meal demonstrate poor judgment? Can you explain why you're suddenly claiming your father isn't your real father after 46 years? Each question made my blood pressure rise, but I forced myself to stay calm, to respond with facts rather than feelings. We'd been working for 3 hours when Luke emerged from the other room, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He was supposed to be watching his movie, but he'd apparently been listening to us instead. He walked over to where we'd spread all our evidence and studied it quietly, his face serious. "Mom," he said suddenly, "why don't you just invite them to dinner again? But this time you pick the menu." The three of us stopped and looked at him. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked. Luke pointed to the timeline Gwen had created. At Thanksgiving, they controlled everything. They picked the place they said mean things, and they made you look bad when you wouldn't pay. But what if you invite them somewhere you plan? You can show everyone who's really kind and who's really mean. Like in chess, you were playing their game. Make them play yours instead. Beverly and Gwen exchanged a look that spoke volumes. My 12-year-old son had just articulated a strategy that neither of these experienced women had considered. The idea of a second dinner one where I controlled every element, where I could publicly demonstrate the difference between cruelty and kindness, between selfishness and generosity. It was brilliant. It was theatrical. It was exactly the kind of public accountability that might actually work. "Luke," Gwen said slowly, "you might have just given us our best weapon." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. An email from an address I didn't recognize, anonymous friend. 23@protonmail.com. The subject line read simply, "Evidence." My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. The email contained a single video file and a brief message. I clicked play, and there it was, security footage from Belmont's restaurant showing our Thanksgiving table from an angle that captured everyone's faces perfectly. The audio was crystal clear. I watched Richard laugh, actually throw his head back and laugh as Valerie delivered her line about Luke deserving leftovers. I heard his voice saying, "She's got a point, Evelyn. You should have just packed the boy something cheap from home." The message below the video read, "Sometimes the truth needs witnesses. Use it wisely. A friend." I stared at the sender address, at those words, "a friend," that had appeared before, and felt a chill run down my spine. Someone was watching. Someone was helping. Someone wanted me to win this fight. But who? The next morning, Gwen arrived at our hotel with a man I'd never met, Marcus Chen, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering hidden financial records. He was in his 40s, wearing glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and he had the focused intensity of someone who viewed numbers the way most people viewed art. "Show me the recipe book," he said without preamble, declining even coffee. I spread out the photographs I'd taken of every page, and he pulled a laptop from his bag, opening several spreadsheet programs I didn't recognize. For the first hour, he barely spoke, just muttered to himself while typing rapid notes. Then he started asking questions. "This recipe for summer harvest soup, it mentions tomatoes and basil seasonal ingredients. That would be July or August. And this margin note says RH 22K. When did your mother write this?" I looked at the date penciled faintly at the bottom of the card. "July 2021, 2 years ago." Marcus nodded, typing furiously. "And winter comfort stew with root vegetables, that's December or January. Margin note KC 15K. Your mother was using seasonal ingredients as date markers. Each recipe corresponds to a specific month and year. The initials are people. RH is Richard Hart. KC is probably Kurt, what's his last name? Callahan. Beverly supplied. Kurt Callahan. And the numbers are dollar amounts?" Marcus continued, his excitement building. Your mother was documenting financial transactions chronologically, disguising them as recipes. This is brilliant. No one would ever look at a recipe book as evidence of financial crimes. Over the next 3 hours, Marcus decoded 22 recipes that my mother had carefully crafted. Each one told a story of theft and deception. Richard had diverted $127,000 from the charity fund over 2 years, moving money into personal accounts through a series of transfers he'd disguised as administrative expenses. Kurt's shell company, TBD Holdings LLC, had received payments totaling $45,000 labeled as consulting fees, but with no actual consulting services rendered. Most damning was a recipe called Lakefront Bouillabaisse, with margin notes detailing meetings between Richard Kurt and representatives from Pinnacle Resort Holdings, including specific dates when money changed hands. "Your mother was investigating her own husband," Marcus said quietly, looking up from his laptop. "She documented everything methodically, knowing she'd need proof that would hold up legally. This isn't just a record, it's a prosecutable case. She was building you an arsenal." Gwen leaned over Marcus's shoulder, studying his analysis. "Can you testify to this at the hearing?" "Absolutely. I can present the pattern, show how the dates and amounts correlate to actual bank transactions, if we can get Richard's financial records. This is solid forensic evidence." I turned to the last page of the recipe book photographs, one I'd barely glanced at before, because it seemed like just another recipe. But now, reading it with new understanding, I saw it for what it really was: my mother's final gift to me. "Justice Served Cold," the title read. Below it, instead of ingredients, was a handwritten note in my mother's careful script. "When they mock you with bread, feed them truth. The original of this book must be authenticated and entered into public record. Do not let them destroy it. I've made 3 copies, one with Beverly, one with Marge, one with my attorney. When the time comes, share the recipe openly. Let the whole town taste what I cooked up." Then, underlined twice, "Consider a public auction or exhibition. Make them bid on their own downfall." I read the words 3 times, feeling my mother's presence so strongly it was almost like she was in the room with us. She'd known. She'd known exactly what Richard and Kurt would try to do after she died. She'd known they'd come after me, after the fund, after everything she'd built. And she'd prepared a trap that they'd spring themselves. Beverly was reading over my shoulder. "A public auction," she murmured. "That's genius." "What are you thinking?" Gwen asked, watching my face. The plan came together in my mind, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place, inspired by my mother's words and Luke's chess analogy from the night before. "I'm going to host a charity auction," I said slowly, the details crystallizing as I spoke. "We'll feature treasured items from the Hart family estate, with all proceeds going to the community fund. The centerpiece will be my mother's recipe book." "But we need the original for court evidence," Marcus protested. "Not the original," I said, smiling for the first time in days. "I'll create a perfect replica, same binding, same paper, my mother's handwriting style. But it will contain only innocent recipes, real family recipes that mean nothing. We'll auction that publicly." Beverly caught on immediately. "Valerie will panic. She'll think it contains the evidence we have. She'll try to buy it to destroy it." "Exactly. It accomplishes 3 things. It drains their resources. It proves I'm acting in good faith for charity, and it draws out anyone else who might be involved in their schemes. Meanwhile, the real recipe book gets authenticated by Marcus and filed with the court as evidence. They'll destroy the fake while the real one puts them in prison." Gwen was grinning now. "Your mother was a strategic genius, and so are you." 3 days later, I stood in Judge Patricia Winter's courtroom, flanked by Gwen on one side and Beverly on the other. Richard sat across the aisle with his high-priced attorneys, looking confident in a way that made my skin crawl. Kurt was beside him, smirking at me as if this was already decided in their favor. Judge Winters was exactly as Gwen had described: a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, and an expression that gave away nothing. She'd spent the morning reviewing our evidence, my impeccable fund management records character statements from nonprofit directors, and Marcus Chen's preliminary analysis of financial irregularities. When she finally spoke, her voice was crisp and authoritative. "I've reviewed all submitted materials. Mr. Hart's petition claims Ms. Evelyn Hart demonstrated poor judgment and potential mental instability, warranting her removal as co-trustee of the Eleanor Hart Community Services Fund. However, the evidence before me shows the opposite. Ms. Hart has managed this fund flawlessly for 3 years. Every dollar is accounted for. Every program has expanded under her leadership. Every quarterly report has been filed on time and with complete transparency." Richard's confident expression began to falter. Judge Winters continued, her gaze shifting to Richard. "What concerns me, Mr. Hart, are these withdrawal patterns your co-trustee's forensic accountant has identified. Large sums with vague documentation transfers to entities with unclear purposes, timing that coincides with your meetings with development companies. I see no cause to remove Ms. Hart from fund management. In fact, Mr. Richard Hart, I'm concerned about these unusual withdrawal patterns. This court is ordering a full audit of all fund transactions over the past 5 years. Ms. Hart, you retain full authority." The gavel came down with a crack that felt like thunder. Richard's face drained of all color, going from ruddy confidence to ashen shock in seconds. His attorney immediately stood stammering something about requesting a recess, but Judge Winters had already dismissed us. As we filed out of the courtroom, I heard Kurt's urgent whisper behind me, meant for Richard, but carrying in the echoing hallway, "We need to move the land deal now before she figures out how deep this goes." Kurt's whispered words echoed in my mind for the entire drive back to the hotel. They needed to move quickly, which meant I needed to move faster. The court victory had bought us time, but not much. Within 24 hours of Judge Winters's ruling, I had Gwen draft invitations for what I was calling the Heart and Heart Heritage Auction, a charity fundraiser for local family services to be held at the Hartsville Community Center. The invitation was carefully worded and olive branch wrapped in velvet. In the spirit of community and family healing, Evelyn Hart invites you to join her in supporting the programs her mother Eleanor held dear. Featured items include donated goods from generous community members and select heirlooms from the Hart family collection. All proceeds benefit youth mentorship programs. I sent personal invitations to Richard, Valerie, and Kurt, each one handwritten with a note about how much it would mean to have them there, how I hoped we could move forward together for the sake of the community our mother loved. Beverly made sure every local newspaper, radio station, and community blog knew about the event. Within 3 days, we had RSVPs from over 200 people, including the mayor, several town council members, and the director of every nonprofit my mother had ever supported. The local news station said they'd send a crew to cover it. The replica recipe book had been perfect. I'd hired a professional calligrapher who specialized in historical documents to recreate my mother's handwriting style, filled it with actual family recipes I remembered from childhood, and had it bound in leather that matched the original. To the casual observer, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. The real recipe book, meanwhile, was locked in a safe at Gwen's law office, cataloged as evidence for the audit. The night of the auction, the community center was packed. Long tables displayed donated items, handmade quilts, gift baskets from local businesses, a weekend stay at a bed and breakfast. But everyone knew what they were really there to see. The recipe book sat on a velvet cushion under glass at the front of the room, spotlit like a museum piece. I wore a navy dress that my mother had always said made me look strong, and I kept Luke close beside me as I greeted guests. Richard arrived late, Beverly on his arm playing her role perfectly, both of them looking uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. Valerie didn't come at all, but I noticed a man I didn't recognize sitting in the back row checking his phone constantly and looking nervous. The auction moved through smaller items, first building momentum. A handmade quilt went for $800. A basket of wine and artisan cheeses sold for $350. People were in a giving mood, the energy in the room warm and generous. Then, the auctioneer, a jovial man named Tom who volunteered with several charities, called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to our featured item of the evening. This beautiful leather-bound recipe book, handwritten by the late Eleanor Hart, contains generations of beloved family recipes. Evelyn, would you like to say a few words? I stepped up to the microphone, very aware of the cameras pointed at me, of Richard's tense posture 3 rows back of the nervous proxy in the back row. My mother poured her heart into this book. Every recipe tells a story of family tradition and the values she held dear. Proceeds from this item will go directly to our youth mentorship program, helping children who need guidance and support. The starting bid is $500. A woman in the second row raised her paddle. $500. $750, called a man I recognized as a teacher from the local high school. $1,000, said another voice. Then the proxy in the back row raised his paddle. $5,000. The room went silent. $5,000 was more than all the other items combined. Tom the auctioneer recovered quickly. We have $5,000. Do I hear $5,500? Beverly, sitting near the middle, raised her paddle. $7,500. The proxy pulled out his phone, had a whispered conversation, then raised his paddle again. $15,000. Gasps rippled through the audience. I watched Richard's face go pale, watched him lean over to whisper something urgent to Beverly, who ignored him completely. The proxy's phone rang. He answered, listened, then called out, $25,000. People were standing now, craning to see who was bidding. Tom looked at me, eyebrows raised, asking silently if this was really happening. I nodded almost imperceptibly. $25,000, Tom repeated. Going once, going twice. The proxy stood, phone pressed to his ear, and I heard Valerie's tinny voice screaming through the speaker. $50,000! Just get it! $50,000, the proxy shouted. The room erupted. Tom had to bang his gavel 3 times to restore order. $50,000, going once, going twice. Sold to the bidder in the back row representing Valerie Hart. Applause thundered through the room as the proxy came forward with shaking hands, writing a check that I knew would clean out a substantial portion of Valerie's savings. Per the auction terms, he had to take possession immediately. He picked up the recipe book and, following what must have been shouted instructions from Valerie, opened it right there on stage. I watched his face as he flipped through pages. Apple pie. Sunday pot roast. Christmas cookies. Eleanor's famous casserole. His expression shifted from anticipation to confusion to horror. He pulled out his phone, held it up so Valerie could see via video chat, and I heard her shriek even from where I stood. I stepped back to the microphone, keeping my voice warm and gracious. My mother always said, never put all your eggs in one basket. Thank you, Valerie, for your generous $50,000 donation to our youth mentorship programs. Because of you, 30 children will have mentors this year. Your mother would be so proud. The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. People stood cheering, not just for the donation, but for the theater of it all. Richard slumped in his seat, his face ashen, finally understanding that he'd been outplayed. Kurt stood abruptly and stormed toward the exit, but not before I saw him pull out his phone, his face twisted with rage. That night, as I was tucking Luke into bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Kurt's number. You think you're clever. We're filing a lawsuit tomorrow for defamation and economic sabotage. And if you keep digging into that property deal, we'll make sure Luke learns some very interesting things about his precious mother's past. Back off now. My hands shook as I screenshot the message. Before I could even call Gwen, my phone showed her typing. She must have been monitoring my messages. Her reply came through Kurt's thread. This is Gwen Park, Ms. Hart's attorney. Your text constitutes witness intimidation and blackmail. We'll be filing our own motion in the morning. I barely slept after Kurt's threatening text and Gwen's swift response. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another attack, another threat, but nothing came. Gwen had stayed in the adjoining room with Luke, insisting on being close in case Kurt escalated. At 2 a.m, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling when someone began pounding on my door. The banging was frantic, desperate, accompanied by muffled sobs. I looked through the peephole and saw Valerie, her face a mess of smeared mascara and tears, her hair disheveled, still wearing what looked like the same clothes from days ago. She was alone, swaying slightly and very clearly drunk. I opened the door with the chain still on. "Valerie." "Let me in," she slurred, her voice breaking. "Please, I need to talk to you." Gwen appeared at my shoulder, having heard the commotion. She nodded slightly, and I unchained the door, letting Valerie stumble inside. The smell of wine hit me immediately, not expensive wine, but the cheap stuff you buy when you're drinking to forget, rather than to enjoy. "You've stolen everything!" Valerie screamed, though the words came out more as a wail. "The money, the auction, the attention, you're taking it all. You've always taken everything." I guided her to the small sofa, Gwen hovering protectively nearby. "Sit down, Val. Let me get you some water." "I don't want your water." But she collapsed onto the sofa anyway, her body shaking with sobs. "You're not even his real daughter, but Dad has always loved you more. Always. Do you know what that feels like? To be the biological child and still come in second." I brought her water anyway, sat down in the chair across from her and waited. Years of dealing with emotional brides had taught me that sometimes people just needed to purge their pain before they could hear reason. I spent my whole life trying to be good enough. Valerie continued her words, tumbling out between sobs. "Perfect grades, perfect husband, perfect house. And none of it mattered because you were the one Mom actually loved. You were James Hart's daughter. You were special. Val. And now you're taking the $50,000 I don't even have. Do you know what Kurt's going to do to me when he finds out I spent that? Do you know what he's already doing?" She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, and for the first time I saw past the cruelty to the terrified woman beneath. "He controls everything. Every credit card, every bank account, every decision. He told me exactly what to say at Thanksgiving. He made me practice it over and over. Say this about the adopted boy. Make her look unstable. We need her to react." I didn't want to hurt Luke. I swear I didn't. But if I don't do what Kurt says, he threatens to leave me with nothing. And I believed him. The admission hung in the air between us. This was what abuse looked like, not always bruises, but control so complete that you lost yourself entirely. I moved from the chair to sit beside her on the sofa, keeping my voice gentle. "Val, when we were kids, you used to share your lunch with me when the other kids called me names. You used to tell them to shut up and leave me alone. I remember that. I don't know when you forgot who you were, but I remember." Valerie's sobs intensified, her whole body curling in on itself. "I forgot because it was easier, because being mean to you made Kurt happy, because Dad would laugh, because I was so angry all the time that you got to be the special one, the adopted one everyone felt sorry for, while I was just the disappointing biological daughter." "You're not disappointing," I said quietly. "You're in an abusive relationship that's made you do terrible things. But Val, it's not too late to step away from Kurt, to tell the truth about what he's been planning. Gwen can help protect you legally if you cooperate. There are ways out." For a moment, I saw hope flicker in her eyes. She looked at Gwen, then back at me, and I could see her actually considering it. Then fear crashed back in like a wave, washing away everything else. "I can't," she whispered. "You don't understand what he'll do. You don't understand what he knows about me, what he'll tell people, how he'll destroy me." She stood abruptly, stumbling toward the door. "I shouldn't have come here. This was a mistake. Valerie, wait." But she was gone, the door slamming behind her, leaving only the smell of cheap wine and desperation in her wake. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun finally rose, I was already dressed, drinking coffee in the hotel lobby, trying to process what Valerie had revealed. That's where Richard found me, looking 20 years older than he had at the auction, his shoulders slumped, walking like a man who'd given up. "Evelyn," he said quietly, not asking permission before sitting down across from me. "I need to talk to you. No lawyers, no games, just you and me." I waited, saying nothing. "I didn't know about the recipe book auction plan," he began, his voice hoarse. "Kurt set that up, told Valerie to bid, never consulted me. When I saw what happened, Saw you play them both like that, I realized something. Your mother taught you well. She taught you to be strategic, to be kind and ruthless at the same time. She never taught me anything except what a disappointment I was. Richard. Eleanor was the best thing that ever happened to me. He interrupted, tears forming in his eyes. I was nothing when she met me. Broke, directionless, working construction jobs and drinking too much. She gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be better. When she got sick, I panicked. I thought if I could secure the property deals, make us wealthy, I'd finally prove I was worthy of the Hart name. Worthy of her. He wiped his eyes roughly. I know I'm not your real father. I've always known. And I've spent 40 years resenting you for it, resenting that you carry James Hart's blood instead of mine. Resenting that Eleanor loved him in a way she never quite loved me. I let that poison everything. I let it turn me into someone who could laugh when Valerie hurt your son. And I'm sorry. God, Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I looked at the man who'd raised me, who'd failed me, who was finally admitting the truth after 46 years. I didn't forgive him, that would take time if it ever came at all. But I saw something real in his remorse. Before I could respond, Beverly burst through the hotel's front doors, her face flushed, her breath coming in gasps. Turn on the news, now. Kurt just checked Richard into St. Mary's Hospital. He's claiming Richard had a stroke and Kurt has medical power of attorney. He's trying to get Richard to sign over control of the estate while he's incapacitated. Richard's face went white. I'm sitting right here. I haven't had a stroke. Kurt doesn't know that yet, Beverly said grimly. He thinks you're at home sleeping. He's moving fast. We were in Beverly's car within minutes, Gwen riding shotgun while Richard sat beside me in the back. His hands gripping his knees so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. Beverly drove with the kind of focused intensity I'd seen in people racing toward emergencies, weaving through morning traffic toward St. Mary's Hospital on the east side of town. How did Kurt even get access to medical power of attorney documents? Gwen asked, already pulling up legal codes on her phone. Those require notarization witnesses. He probably forged them, Beverly said grimly. He's been planning this for weeks. I heard him on the phone with someone talking about backup plans in case the fund audit went badly. We pulled into the hospital parking lot and ran toward the main entrance, Richard keeping pace despite his age. The woman at the information desk directed us to the 4th floor, and when we emerged from the elevator, I immediately spotted the problem. A hospital security guard stood outside room 412, arms crossed, looking uncomfortable but resolute. I need to see my father, I said, approaching quickly. The guard held up a hand. I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Callahan has given strict instructions. The patient is in a fragile state and can only see immediate family. He says Mr. Hart suffered a stroke and needs rest. I am immediate family, I insisted. I'm his daughter. Mr. Callahan said you might say that, but that you've been causing the family distress and Mr. Hart doesn't want to see you right now. He showed me medical power of attorney documents. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see Richard lying in the hospital bed, Kurt leaning over him with papers spread across a tray table, and a man in an expensive suit, obviously a lawyer, standing on the other side. Richard looked groggy, his eyes half closed, his head lolling slightly. Beverly stepped forward, her voice sharp. I'm Richard Hart's domestic partner. I have legal standing to be in that room. Mr. Callahan anticipated that too, the guard said apologetically. He said Mr. Hart recently ended that relationship, and you're not to be admitted. I'm sorry, but I have to follow the instructions I was given. Gwen pulled out her phone. I'm calling hospital administration. This is elder exploitation, and if you continue to prevent us from accessing— The documents looked legitimate, the guard interrupted, but his certainty was wavering. I'm just doing my job. Beverly had her phone out too, dialing a number she apparently had on speed dial. Detective Martinez, this is Beverly Chen. I need you at St. Mary's Hospital immediately. 4th floor, room 412. We have a situation involving potential exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Kurt Callahan is attempting to coerce Richard Hart into signing legal documents while claiming he's incapacitated. Yes, I'll wait for you here. Inside the room, I watched Kurt point to something on the papers, watched the lawyer hand Richard a pen. Richard's hand trembled as he reached for it, his movements slow and uncertain. My heart was pounding. We were going to be too late. What I didn't know, what none of us knew except Richard himself, was that the man in that hospital bed was not confused at all. Earlier that morning, when Kurt had shown up at Richard's house claiming he needed to take him to a doctor's appointment for some test results, Richard had grown suspicious. Beverly had been teaching him things over the past weeks, little tricks of self-protection, including how to activate the voice recording app on his phone discreetly. Richard had pressed record the moment he got into Kurt's car, and the phone was now tucked under his hospital gown, capturing every word. Kurt's voice, muffled through the door, but audible when I pressed my ear against it, was cajoling and urgent. "Just sign here, Richard. It's a temporary transfer of estate management, just until you're feeling better. For your own protection." Richard's voice came out slurred, confused. What am I signing?" "Nothing to worry about," Kurt assured him. "Just paperwork. The lawyer here has it all figured out. You trust me, right? I'm family." Will this hurt Evelyn?" Richard mumbled his words, barely coherent. Kurt's response was quick, dismissive. "Don't worry about her. She's been taken care of. This is about protecting you and Valerie, your real family." I felt sick. Through the window, I saw Kurt actually grab Richard's hand, trying to force it to hold the pen to sign the document. The lawyer looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Then Detective Sarah Martinez arrived, striding down the hallway with 2 uniformed officers, her badge visible on her belt. The security guard stepped aside immediately, and Beverly pushed open the door without waiting for permission. At the exact same moment, Richard sat up in bed, his posture straightening, his eyes suddenly clear and focused. His voice when he spoke was strong and steady, with no trace of the confusion he'd been feigning. "I've been recording this entire conversation," Richard announced, pulling his phone from under his gown and holding it up for everyone to see. "I believe that constitutes attempted fraud and elder abuse. Detective, you'll want to hear this." Kurt's face drained of all color, going from ruddy confidence to ashen horror in a single heartbeat. You were faking." The lawyer backed away rapidly, hands up. "I didn't know. He told me his father-in-law was confused and needed help with estate management. I had no idea." Kurt lunged for Richard's phone, but he was too slow. One of the officers caught him mid-lunge, pinning his arms behind his back while Kurt screamed obscenities. Detective Martinez took Richard's phone, carefully reviewing the recording right there in the room, her expression growing darker with each passing second. "Kurt Callahan," she said formally, "you're under arrest for attempted exploitation of an elderly person, fraud, and assault." She nodded to the officers who produced handcuffs. "You senile old fool!" Kurt screamed at Richard as they led him toward the door. "You've ruined everything. Everything you were supposed to be easy." Richard's voice when he responded was quiet but carried weight. "No, I almost ruined everything. This is me trying to fix it." We stood in stunned silence as they took Kurt away, his protests echoing down the hospital corridor. Richard looked at me, at Beverly, at Gwen, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine humility. "Beverly taught me the recording trick," he said softly. "She said someday I might need to protect myself from the people I thought were allies. I didn't want to believe her. I was wrong about a lot of things." As Beverly helped Richard with the discharge paperwork at the nurse's station, a young nurse approached me, glancing nervously at the commotion Kurt's arrest had caused. "Mrs. Hart, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a woman in the chapel who asked to see you. She said she knew your mother. She's been here every day this week praying." My heart began to pound. "What does she look like?" "Older, maybe 70. Gray coat, carries a worn leather journal. She wouldn't give her name, just said to tell you she knew Eleanor." I walked toward the hospital chapel on unsteady legs, pushing open the heavy wooden doors to find the small room dim and quiet. There, kneeling in the front pew, was the woman in the gray coat. She must have heard me enter because she turned slowly, and as our eyes met, I gasped. The face was weathered and aged, marked by years I hadn't witnessed, but the eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. 2 weeks had passed since that moment in the hospital chapel. 2 weeks since I'd looked into eyes I thought I'd never see again. What the woman in the gray coat had told me changed everything, but those revelations would have to wait. First, I had one final public reckoning to orchestrate. The invitations went out on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, formal enough to command respect, but warm enough to convey genuine welcome. Leftovers worth serving a community gratitude gathering. They read, "Join us for an evening celebrating the true meaning of gratitude where everyone receives the feast they deserve." I personally delivered invitations to Richard, to Valerie, to Beverly. I sent them to every town council member, to local media outlets, to the directors of nonprofits my mother had supported. And most importantly, I hand-delivered invitations to families staying at the Hartsville homeless shelter. Scraps. The management had been surprisingly cooperative when I'd explained my vision, perhaps because the first Thanksgiving dinner had generated significant publicity for them. When I'd made my initial request months ago to have the event recorded, I'd also asked them to preserve any leftover food from our meal, citing my professional habit as an event planner to document everything thoroughly. They'd agreed vacuum sealing and freezing the uneaten portions. Now, for $12,000, they were willing to reheat those exact leftovers and serve them as I directed. The evening of the dinner arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind of false spring that sometimes hits Texas in late November. I wore a dress my mother had given me years ago, emerald green silk, that she'd said made me look like someone who couldn't be broken. Luke stood beside me at the entrance, greeting guests, looking so grown up in his suit that my heart ached with pride. When people entered the private dining room, they found a seating arrangement that told its own story. The main table, positioned prominently in the center, held 3 place settings. 2 were occupied by name cards for Richard and Valerie. The third between them held a card that read Kurt Callahan above an empty chair. A ghost at the feast, a reminder that some people removed themselves from the table through their own choices. Each occupied place card bore a virtue: humility for Richard, honesty for Valerie. Surrounding this central table were others filled with families from the shelter, volunteers from community organizations, and local residents who'd supported the Heart Foundation. Their place cards bore different words: dignity, worth, belonging, grace. At a table near the window sat my chosen family: Beverly, Gwen, Marge, Detective Martinez, Luke, and myself, each of our cards reading simply gratitude. Media cameras were positioned discreetly around the room. Michelle Torres from Channel 5 was doing a live broadcast, her camera operator capturing everything. I'd made sure of it. When everyone was seated, I stood, and the room quieted. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. 3 months ago, at a dinner in this very restaurant, I was told that my son deserved leftovers because of his circumstances. Tonight, I want to show what leftovers really mean and who truly deserves the feast. I nodded to the servers, who began bringing out dishes with choreographed precision. To the families from the shelter, men, women, children who'd known hunger and uncertainty, came plates of Maine lobster with drawn butter, prime rib cooked to perfection, truffle risotto, roasted vegetables that looked like art. Crystal glasses were filled with sparkling cider for the children, good wine for the adults who wanted it. I watched a little girl's eyes go wide as a server set lobster in front of her, watched her mother's tears fall silently as she realized this wasn't a mistake. To Richard and Valerie came the reheated leftovers from our Thanksgiving meal. Cold turkey that had been frozen and thawed, gravy that had congealed and been reheated into an unappetizing sludge, rolls hardened beyond redemption, served on plain white plates with plastic utensils. Exactly what they'd implied my son deserved. Valerie's face crumpled immediately, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at her plate. Richard didn't cry, but something in him seemed to break as he looked from his plate to the joyful faces of children across the room, savoring lobster they'd never imagined tasting. "The food isn't the point," I continued, my voice carrying across the silent room. It's how we treat the people we're feeding. My mother taught me that kindness is the only meal that matters. And tonight, those who showed the least kindness get to experience what they prescribed for others. Meanwhile, those whom society so often tells deserve leftovers, they get the feast. Because everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves to belong. Everyone deserves the whole meal. The silence stretched for one heartbeat, too. Then a man at one of the shelter tables, a father with 3 children, stood and began to applaud. The sound built like a wave, everyone rising, cameras flashing, the room filling with the thunder of vindication and justice and communal recognition that something profound had just happened. As the applause finally died down and servers began clearing plates, I saw Detective Martinez step out to take a phone call. When she returned moments later, her expression was grave. She approached me quietly, leaning in to whisper, "We've just arrested Kurt's business partner, someone you know. There's been a development in the property fraud case. We need you to come to the station. Tonight." Before I could respond, before I could even process what she'd said, Valerie stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Evelyn, wait!" she called out, her voice breaking across the room, making everyone turn. "There's something I need to tell you about Mom, something she made me promise never to say. But after tonight, you deserve to know." Valerie's words hung in the air, but Detective Martinez was already guiding me toward the door. "I'm sorry, but this can't wait," she said firmly. "We need your statement tonight." I looked back at Valerie, saw her tear-streaked face, and mouthed "later" before following the detective out. Whatever my sister needed to confess about our mother would have to keep a few more hours. At the police station, Detective Martinez led me to a conference room where another detective waited with a laptop and a stack of photographs. "The business partner we arrested," Martinez said without preamble, "is someone you've met. His name is David Chen. He's the brother of Marcus Chen, your forensic accountant." My stomach dropped. Marcus had seemed so trustworthy, so thorough in decoding my mother's recipe book. "Marcus is involved." "No," Martinez clarified quickly. Marcus had no knowledge of his brother's activities. David Chen is a real estate attorney who's been facilitating Kurt's shell company transactions. We arrested him tonight based on evidence from Kurt's financial records. He's already talking, trying to cut a deal. The interview lasted 2 hours with me providing timeline details about Kurt's behavior, the property schemes, everything Beverly had documented. When I finally left the station, it was nearly midnight. But the night's drama was far from over. The next morning, Gwen called me at 7 a.m., her voice tight with controlled fury. "Kurt filed a lawsuit against you from jail. $2 million for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and economic sabotage. His attorney is claiming the public dinners and auction were calculated to destroy his business reputation and that you've orchestrated a campaign of harassment." "He's suing me while he's in jail for trying to defraud Richard," I asked incredulously. "His lawyer is good. They're painting you as a vindictive woman, weaponizing public sentiment against an innocent businessman who was just trying to help his father-in-law with estate management." Gwen's tone made it clear what she thought of this strategy. "Don't worry. We'll destroy this in court. But it gets worse. Kurt posted bail an hour ago." How bail was set at $100,000. "Anonymous source," Gwen said grimly. "Someone doesn't want him talking from behind bars." That night I woke to my phone buzzing with news alerts. Fire at Hartsville Town Records office. Suspected arson. Document storage severely damaged. I called Marge immediately, my heart racing. If the property deeds were destroyed, if Kurt had succeeded in erasing the evidence of the public trust designation. "Calm down," Marge said, her voice steady despite the late hour. "Beverly and I planned for this weeks ago. We worked with County Clerk Susan Oakes to create certified copies of every Hart family document. We've got copies in Gwen's fireproof safe copies with the Texas State Archives, and the county digitized everything in 2018. Whatever Kurt burned, we can replace." The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Kurt was escalating, getting desperate, making moves that would only dig him deeper. By morning, Detective Martinez confirmed what we'd all suspected. Security footage showed a masked figure breaking a window at the records office at 2:47 a.m. Traffic cameras caught Kurt's distinctive truck, a black F-250 with custom rims 2 blocks away at exactly that time. Arson investigators found accelerant patterns consistent with gasoline and recovered partial fingerprints from broken glass that matched Kurt's prints from his arrest at the hospital. The police picked Kurt up at a motel on the highway where he'd apparently been hiding since making bail. When they arrested him this time, Detective Martinez told me later something in him snapped. He'd gone from confident businessman to cornered animal in less than 24 hours. "I wasn't alone," he'd shouted as they handcuffed him in the motel parking lot, his voice carrying across to other guests who'd come out to watch. "Richard knew about the plan. He approved everything. You think I did this by myself? Richard Hart has been part of this from the beginning." Richard, who'd been staying at Beverly's house under her watchful care, was brought in for questioning. He sat in the interview room looking old and broken, categorically denying any knowledge of the arson. "I knew about the property scheme," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I knew Kurt was working with developers. But burning down the records office, I would never approve that. I'm not a criminal." But the damage was done. Kurt's accusation had implicated Richard formally in a conspiracy that now included arson and destruction of public property. Investigators started pulling Richard's phone records, his bank statements, looking for any communication that might corroborate Kurt's claim. That's when federal investigators arrived. The shell company that had posted Kurt's bail, Pinnacle Resort Holdings LLC, was traced back to a Dallas developer with projects in 3 states. The fraud wasn't just local anymore. It crossed state lines, involved interstate commerce, potentially violated federal racketeering statutes. The case that had started as a family dispute over a Thanksgiving dinner had metastasized into something that could put multiple people in federal prison. 3 days later, Detective Martinez called me to her office. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept since Kurt's arrest. "He wants to make a deal," she said without preamble. "Kurt's attorney has approached the DA. He'll provide evidence against everyone involved. Richard, the Dallas developers, the county officials who might have been taking bribes in exchange for reduced charges." "How reduced?" I asked. 10 years instead of 20, maybe less with good behavior. But here's the problem, Evelyn. The evidence he's offering includes Valerie's role in all of this. Text messages where she fed him information about your schedule, about Richard's medical appointments, about the charity fund details. If Kurt testifies, Valerie could be charged as an accessory to fraud and arson conspiracy. My blood ran cold. Valerie, who'd shown up drunk at my hotel room, who'd admitted Kurt controlled her completely, who was already broken by guilt and fear. What would she be facing? 5 to 15 years, depending on how involved the DA thinks she was. She helped Kurt, Evelyn. She knew about the schemes, even if she didn't know about the arson specifically. Conspiracy charges don't require you to commit the actual crime just to further it in some way. Martinez leaned forward, her eyes searching my face. "We need to know, do you want your sister prosecuted to the fullest extent, or do you want her to have a chance to cooperate first?" I opened my mouth to answer Detective Martinez's question, but before I could speak, there was a commotion in the hallway. Through the conference room's glass wall, I saw Valerie walking toward us, flanked by an attorney I didn't recognize. She looked terrible, unwashed hair, no makeup, wearing sweatpants, and an oversized sweater that hung off her frame like she'd lost significant weight in just days. "My client would like to give a voluntary statement," the attorney announced as they entered. "She's prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation." Detective Martinez exchanged a glance with me, then nodded. "Let's move to an interview room." And what followed was one of the most painful hours of my life. Valerie sat across from Detective Martinez and a recording device, her hands trembling so badly she had to clasp them together on the table. Her attorney sat beside her, occasionally touching her shoulder for support. I knew Kurt was planning to pressure Richard about the property sale. Valerie began, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me he needed information about Dad's schedule, about when Evelyn would be in town, about details of the charity fund. I gave him that information. I helped him. She paused, wiping tears with a tissue. But I swear I had no knowledge of the arson. When I saw the news about the fire, I was horrified. I called Kurt and he told me to shut up and not ask questions. Her attorney produced a phone already queued to a series of text messages. Detective Martinez read them aloud for the recording. "If you don't help me, I'll make sure everyone knows about your DUI from 2019 that I covered up." Another one. "Your father will disown you if I tell him about the gambling debts. Is that what you want?" "He had leverage over me," Valerie said, her voice breaking. "I got a DUI 2 years ago and Kurt paid off the officer to make it go away. I developed a gambling problem, online poker, and lost $30,000 that Kurt had to cover. He held these things over my head constantly, told me I owed him, that I had to help or he'd destroy me. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I was trapped." The interview continued for another 40 minutes, Valerie providing details about meetings she'd witnessed, conversations she'd overheard, timelines that corroborated what Beverly had already documented. By the end, it was clear that while Valerie had been complicit in the property scheme, she'd been a coerced accomplice, rather than an active conspirator. 2 days later, the district attorney called a meeting with Valerie, her attorney Gwen, and me. The DA was a stern woman named Patricia Flores, who had a reputation for being tough but fair. Based on Ms. Valerie Hart's cooperation and the evidence of coercion, DA Flores said, reading from notes, "I'm prepared to offer a plea deal. She pleads guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, a lesser charge. In exchange, 3 years probation, 300 hours of community service, mandatory counseling for domestic abuse and financial literacy training. No jail time. She also agrees to testify against Kurt Callahan and any other defendants if this goes to trial." She looked at me directly. "Ms. Evelyn Hart, as the primary victim in this case, you have the right to submit a victim impact statement that will influence the judge's final sentencing decision. Your input matters here." Gwen leaned over and whispered, "You have every right to want maximum punishment, but consider what your mother would have wanted: justice or revenge." I asked for a private meeting with Valerie. The DA arranged for us to use a conference room, just the two of us, no attorneys. Valerie couldn't meet my eyes when she entered, keeping her gaze fixed on the table between us. "Look at me, Val," I said quietly. She raised her eyes slowly, tears already forming. "At Thanksgiving, when you said Luke deserved leftovers, did you mean it, or were you performing for Kurt?" The question seemed to break something in her. She sobbed openly, her whole body shaking. "I didn't mean it. I love Luke. I've always loved him. He's my nephew and he's a beautiful kid, and I hated myself the moment those words came out of my mouth. But Kurt made me practice it beforehand. He said I needed to prove I was tough enough, that I wasn't weak like—" her voice caught, "like you. He always said you were weak because you were kind. And I was so desperate to make him happy to avoid his anger that I became someone I don't even recognize." I sat with her words, feeling the weight of them. This was my sister, the girl who used to share her lunch with me, who'd defended me from bullies before she became one herself. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself in someone else's cruelty. "I'm going to write a statement supporting the plea deal," I said finally. "Not because you deserve mercy, I'm not sure you do, but because the cycle of cruelty has to end somewhere. Our mother taught me that healing matters more than revenge. But Valerie, you have to do the work. You have to rebuild yourself into someone Luke can actually look up to. Someone I can eventually trust again. That's going to take years, and it's going to be hard, and I'm not promising forgiveness. But I'm giving you the chance to try." Valerie nodded through her tears, whispering, "Thank you," over and over, until the words lost meaning. When we left the police station that afternoon, we were ambushed by reporters and cameras. The story had gone regional, now picked up by Dallas news stations, and even a few national outlets. A reporter I didn't recognize shoved a microphone in my face, shouting, "Ms. Hart, is it true you're letting your sister off easy while pursuing the death penalty for your brother-in-law?" I was about to correct the absurd claim Texas doesn't have the death penalty for financial crimes when someone stepped into frame beside me. Richard, looking older and more weathered than ever, positioned himself slightly in front of me like a shield. "My daughter has shown more grace than I ever showed her," he said directly to the cameras. "If you want a villain in this story, look at me. I enabled this entire situation through my weakness and greed. I let jealousy poison me for 40 years. Evelyn is choosing mercy because that's who she is. That's who her mother raised her to be. I had nothing to do with that." The 4 months between Richard's public confession and Kurt's trial felt like living in suspended animation. Luke went back to school. I tried to maintain my wedding planning business, and the Hart Foundation continued its work with Beverly at the helm, but everything felt like we were holding our breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. When the trial finally began in March, the courthouse was packed. Kurt had been denied bail after the arson charges, and the time in jail had changed him. Gone was the confident businessman who'd sat at Thanksgiving dinner smirking at me. The man who shuffled into court in an orange jumpsuit looked diminished, desperate, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. The prosecution, led by DA Patricia Flores herself, built their case with methodical precision. First came the surveillance footage from the night of the fire. Grainy but unmistakable, a figure in dark clothing breaking the window of the records office at 2:53 a.m. Then traffic camera footage showing Kurt's distinctive black F-250 truck 2 blocks away at 2:47 a.m. The arson investigator testified about accelerant patterns consistent with gasoline and the partial fingerprints recovered from broken glass that matched Kurt's prints perfectly. But it was the financial evidence that truly damned him. Marcus Chen, my forensic accountant, walked the jury through shell company transactions showing $340,000 flowing from Pinnacle Resort Holdings to Kurt's various business entities. The money trail was undeniable, each transfer meticulously documented. Gwen then introduced emails between Kurt and the Dallas developers' messages that made several jurors visibly recoil. "We need to neutralize the Hart woman before she figures out the property angle," one email read. Another, "The public trust problem needs to be eliminated permanently if necessary." Kurt's attorney objected strenuously, claiming the language was metaphorical, but the damage was done. The hospital recording played for the jury was devastating in its clarity. Richard's voice feigning confusion. "Will this hurt Evelyn?" And Kurt's response cold and dismissive. "Don't worry about her. She's been taken care of." The jury watched Kurt on the recording physically grab Richard's hand, trying to force him to sign documents, while believing him to be incapacitated. 2 jurors actually shook their heads in disgust. The prosecution's final bombshell came from Detective Martinez, who testified about Kurt's internet search history from 3 days before the recipe book auction. How to decode secret accounting records. He'd searched along with hidden financial documentation in recipe books, and how to authenticate old recipe journals. It proved beyond doubt that Kurt knew exactly what he was bidding on, that he understood the recipe book contained evidence against him. Then came Valerie's testimony, and I had to admit my sister was brave. She walked to the stand with her head high despite her obvious terror, swore her oath, and told the truth in a voice that occasionally trembled, but never broke. "Kurt controlled every aspect of my life," she said, looking directly at the jury. "Every credit card, every bank account, every decision. He would rehearse conversations with me, tell me exactly what to say to my sister, to my father. At Thanksgiving, he made me practice the line about Luke deserving leftovers. Over and over until I said it with the right tone. I was so afraid of him that I became someone I didn't recognize." Kurt's defense attorney, a slick Dallas lawyer named Robert Chen, who wore expensive suits and spoke in smooth, calculated tones, tried to paint Valerie as a willing participant. "Isn't it true you benefited financially from these schemes?" he asked. "I was given an allowance," Valerie replied steadily. "Money Kurt controlled. Money he threatened to take away if I didn't cooperate. I was afraid. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it explains it. And I'm here now telling the truth, which is more than Kurt has ever done." The trial lasted 3 days. Closing arguments took 4 hours combined. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before the forewoman sent word they'd reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom, my hands clasped so tightly with Luke's on one side and Beverly's on the other that my fingers went numb. "On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find?" the judge asked. "Guilty." "On the count of attempted exploitation of an elderly person." "Guilty." "On the count of arson in the first degree." "Guilty." "On the count of destruction of public records." "Guilty." Kurt's face remained impassive through all 4 verdicts, but I saw his hands trembling on the defense table. 2 weeks later at sentencing, Judge Patricia Winters looked down at him with an expression of profound disappointment. "Mr. Callahan, you targeted a family's legacy, attempted to destroy public property, and showed no remorse throughout this trial. You sought to profit from deception and were willing to commit arson to cover your tracks. This sentence reflects the severity of putting personal greed above community welfare. I hereby sentence you to 18 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice with possibility of parole after 12 years. Additionally, you will pay $500,000 in restitution to the Hart Community Restoration Fund." The gavel fell. As bailiffs approached to take Kurt away, he turned and looked directly at me. His lips moved silently, forming words I could read clearly. "This isn't over." Then he was gone, led through a side door to begin his sentence. The courtroom erupted in conversation, but I felt strangely empty. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel triumphant. It just felt necessary. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, supporters holding signs thanking me for protecting the lakefront, but also protesters claiming wealthy families were using the courts to settle personal scores. A reporter pushed through, microphone extended. "Ms. Hart, what's next for you and your family?" Before I could answer, an elderly man in an impeccable gray suit stepped forward from the crowd. He had kind eyes and carried a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. "Ms. Hart, my name is William Thornton. I'm an attorney representing the Hart Family Historical Society. We've been waiting 30 years for someone to claim their rightful place." He paused, glancing at the cameras before continuing. "Your biological father, James Nathaniel Hart, left a trust worth approximately $4.2 million held in probate, pending identification of his heir. We believe that heir is you." William Thornton invited me to his office the following week, a wood-paneled space filled with leather-bound legal volumes and photographs documenting Hartsville's history. He spread documents across his mahogany desk with the care of someone handling sacred texts. When James Nathaniel Hart died in that construction accident in 1979, he was only 32 years old. Thornton began, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "His will was straightforward, everything to my child or children. He knew your mother was pregnant, but you hadn't been born yet, so he couldn't name you specifically. The problem arose when your mother married Richard Hart a year later and amended your birth certificate listing Richard as your father. Without DNA evidence or the original birth certificate, the Hart family executors couldn't conclusively prove you were James's biological child." He pulled out a leather portfolio containing investment statements. "So the estate went into trust, the property, the investments, everything. We've been managing it for 40 years, watching the principal grow, waiting for the rightful heir to emerge. I've been the trustee for the last 15 years, and I've been monitoring your situation closely, especially after your mother's death. When the trial revealed the original birth certificate, I knew it was time." "How much has it grown to?" I asked, though Thornton had mentioned the figure outside the courthouse. $4.2 million. The lakefront property alone is worth $2 million at current market rates, though of course it can never be sold given your father's public trust designation. The remaining funds are investment savings and accumulated interest." He slid papers toward me. "With the original birth certificate, court records establishing your identity, and if necessary DNA comparison to items preserved from your father's personal effects, we can settle the estate within 60 days. The reality of it hit me then, not the money, but the fact that my father, a man who died before I was born, had tried to provide for me across decades. He'd trusted that eventually the truth would surface, and I'd receive what he'd left behind. 3 days later, I stood at a podium in front of the Hart family homestead, a Victorian house that now served as a small museum documenting the town's history. Media representatives filled the front lawn cameras positioned to capture every word. Luke stood beside me wearing the same navy blazer from Thanksgiving, though he'd grown enough that the sleeves were getting short. "My name is Evelyn Hart." I began holding up the authenticated birth certificate for the cameras to see. "And I'm the daughter of James Nathaniel Hart, who founded the public trust that protects our lakefront. For 46 years, I didn't know this truth. My mother kept it secret, I believe, to protect me and to protect the legacy my father built. But secrets have a way of surfacing when they need to." I explained the trust, the inheritance, the decades of waiting. Then I announced what I'd spent the past week planning with Gwen Beverly and Marge. "I'm not keeping this money for personal use. Instead, I'm establishing the James and Eleanor Hart Community Foundation, named for both my biological father and my mother who loved him. This foundation will be dedicated to 3 purposes. First, ensuring the lakefront remains protected as permanent public land never to be developed or sold. Second, providing college scholarships specifically for adopted and foster children because every child deserves to know they're worthy of investment. And third, supporting domestic abuse survivors as they rebuild their lives in honor of my sister Valerie's struggle and recovery." The crowd was silent, absorbing this. I continued. "My mother and father, both James and Richard, because family is complicated, believed in community over individual wealth. This is how I honor that belief. This town raised me even when I didn't know my full history. Now I'm giving back what was always meant to belong to everyone." Before I could step away from the podium, Richard approached from the side of the crowd. He looked smaller somehow, aged by the trial, and everything that had preceded it. He gestured toward the microphone, and I nodded, stepping aside. 46 years ago," Richard said, his voice carrying despite its tremor, "I married a woman who loved another man, a better man than me. Eleanor gave me a home, a purpose, and a daughter to raise. I repaid her by resenting that daughter, by spending decades trying to claim a legacy I didn't earn, and by enabling a criminal to nearly destroy everything she built." He turned to look at me directly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Evelyn, you owe me nothing. But I'm asking not for forgiveness, because I don't deserve that, but for a chance to spend whatever time I have left proving I can be the father your real dad would have wanted you to have." The silence stretched. Cameras clicked. I let him stand there, let him feel the weight of public vulnerability the way I'd felt it at Thanksgiving. Then I stepped forward. "Dad and you are my dad because family is what we make of it, not just what we're born into. I accept your apology, but trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt with action, day by day, choice by choice. If you mean what you say, I'll see it in the years ahead. And maybe eventually we'll find our way back to something that looks like family." Richard nodded, unable to speak, and stepped back into the crowd. Beverly was there to catch him, to steady him, and I saw genuine care in how she held his arm. That evening, exhausted from the press conference and the emotional toll of the day, I returned to my hotel. The desk clerk flagged me down, holding a small package. "This arrived for you this afternoon, Miss Hart. No return address." Inside the package was a flash drive and a note in handwriting that stopped my heart. My mother's distinctive script, unmistakable even after 3 years. "If you're reading this, you've found everything I left for you. But there's one more gift I couldn't give you until you were ready. Watch the video. And remember, I never really left." I held that flash drive in my hand for 3 days before I could bring myself to watch it. Somehow seeing my mother's handwriting again, knowing there was one more message waiting, felt both like a gift and a wound I wasn't ready to reopen. So I threw myself into other things. The foundation paperwork, Luke's schoolwork, the daily rhythms of life that had been disrupted for months. It was during those weeks that I began to notice Richard showing up in ways he never had before. The first time I almost didn't recognize him. I'd stopped by the community center to check on meal service for our homeless outreach program, and there he was wearing an apron and hairnet ladling soup into bowls with the careful attention of someone trying to get it exactly right. One of the program coordinators, Maria, saw me staring and came over. "He's been here every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 weeks," she said quietly. "Shows up at 10, works through lunch service, stays to help with cleanup. Never complains. Never asks for special treatment. Just works." I watched him serve a family I recognized from the leftovers worth serving dinner, a father with 3 young children who'd been living out of their car until we'd helped them get temporary housing. Richard handed the man a bowl of soup and said something that made him smile. It was such a small moment, but it felt monumental. He didn't stop there. Within a month, Richard had signed over his entire share of the charity fund management to me, going through Gwen to make it legally binding with no strings attached. He appeared at town council meetings, standing before the same people he'd tried to deceive, and admitted publicly, "I conspired with my son-in-law to defraud this community. I tried to sell land that was never mine to sell. I enabled someone who committed arson. I'm here to advocate for permanent protection of the lakefront and to ask for nothing but the chance to make partial amends." The council members had been stunned into silence. Mayor Rodriguez had finally said, "Mr. Hart, we appreciate your honesty. It doesn't undo the damage, but it's a start." Then there was the donation, $50,000 from Richard's personal savings transferred to the Hart Foundation with a note that simply read, "For the children who deserve better than I gave my own." When I'd called to thank him, he'd said, "It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's what I have." But the most surprising change was his consistency. He showed up at Luke's soccer games, sitting in the bleachers with Beverly cheering when Luke made a good play, but never pushing too hard, never trying to coach from the sidelines the way some grandfathers did. He helped me move into a new house closer to Luke's school, carrying boxes without complaint, even though I could see it tired him. He was just there, present without demanding acknowledgement or praise. One Saturday afternoon, about 6 weeks after the trial, Richard approached me with an unusual request. "I'd like to take Luke somewhere," he said. "Just the 2 of us. Grandfather-grandson time. I understand if you don't trust me, but I'm asking anyway." Every protective instinct I had screamed no. But Luke, who'd been listening from the kitchen, came out and said, "I want to go, Mom. It's okay." I set conditions. Richard had to tell me exactly where they were going. Luke had to keep his phone on, and he could call me to come get him at any time with no questions asked. Richard agreed to everything without hesitation. They went to the lakefront. Luke told me about it that evening, his words tumbling out with the enthusiasm of a 12-year-old who'd learned something that mattered. "Grandpa showed me the plaque about James Nathaniel Hart, about your real dad. He told me stories about how he wanted everyone to be able to use the lake, not just rich people. And he said..." Luke paused, getting the words exactly right. He said, "Your mom comes from good people, Luke, and so do you. I messed up by forgetting that. But I want you to know your real history, the good parts and the hard parts. You deserve to know where you come from." "What else did he say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Luke looked down at his hands. "I asked him why he was so mean to you, at Thanksgiving and before." My heart stopped. "What did he say?" "He started crying a little. He said he was jealous of a ghost of a man he could never be as good as, and that he let that jealousy poison him. Then he said he's trying to do better now." Luke looked up at me with those wise eyes. "I told him okay, but he has to keep trying. That's what you always say to me, keep trying even when it's hard." I pulled Luke into a hug, overwhelmed by his capacity for wisdom and forgiveness that I was still struggling to find. 2 months after the press conference, we had dinner together, Evelyn, Luke, Richard, Beverly, and Gwen, at a small Italian restaurant that didn't carry the weight of history like Belmont's did. It was supposed to be a celebration of the foundation's official launch, but partway through the meal, Richard set down his fork and cleared his throat. I need to tell you all something, he said, his voice serious. I've been to see a cardiologist. They've diagnosed me with early-stage heart disease, the same condition that killed Eleanor. The table went silent. Beverly reached for his hand, her face stricken. Is it? I couldn't finish the question. Manageable, Richard said quickly. With medication, lifestyle changes, monitoring. It's not an immediate death sentence, but it's a wake-up call. My doctor said I probably have years if I take care of myself, but there are no guarantees. He looked directly at me. I don't know how much time I have, Evelyn. I wasted so many years on the wrong things, on jealousy, on greed, on trying to be something I wasn't. I want to spend whatever's left doing right by you and Luke. If you'll let me. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. This man had hurt me so deeply for so long, but he was also the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me with my math homework, who'd walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Family was complicated. Forgiveness was complicated. But maybe, just maybe, we could find our way to something real. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. One day at a time, Dad. One day at a time. His grip tightened, and I saw relief flood his face. One day at a time, he repeated. That night, after Luke was in bed and the house was quiet, I finally inserted the flash drive into my laptop. My hands shook as I clicked the video file. The screen filled with my mother's face, thinner than I remembered, her skin pale, but her eyes still sharp with the intelligence and love I'd known my whole life. She was sitting in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd taught me to bake cookies, where we'd had countless conversations over tea. "Hello, my darling girl," she said, and hearing her voice again nearly broke me. "If you're seeing this, you've survived what I knew was coming. You've found the recipe book. You've discovered the truth about your father. You've fought back against those who tried to take what was yours. I'm so proud of you." She paused, taking a labored breath that reminded me of how sick she'd been at the end. "I have one more secret to share with you, one that will explain everything. You see, I didn't just leave you evidence, I left you a witness. Someone who knew everything, who watched and waited, who was instructed to reveal themselves only when you were strong enough to handle the truth. That woman you saw, the one in the gray coat outside the church at the hospital." My heart stopped. "She's not a stranger, Evelyn, and this final truth will change everything you thought you understood about our family." I sat frozen, staring at the screen as my mother's words echoed in my mind. The woman in the gray coat. The one I'd seen outside the church at the hospital chapel. My mother knew about her. My mother had arranged for her to be there. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair on the video, wincing with pain she was trying to hide. "Let me start at the beginning, darling. When I learned my heart was failing, the doctors gave me 18 months, maybe 2 years. I had a choice to make: tell you everything immediately, hand you all the evidence, explain about James and Richard and the property schemes I'd discovered, or prepare you to discover it yourself." She paused, taking a sip from a mug that I recognized as her favorite, the one with painted violets that she'd used every morning for as long as I could remember. "I chose the harder path, and I need you to understand why. If I'd simply given you everything, the birth certificate, the documents, the evidence of Richard's schemes, what would have happened? Richard and Valerie would have challenged it all. They would have said I was senile, that I was manipulating you, that I was rewriting history out of spite or confusion. They would have fought you in court for years, draining your resources and your spirit. And worse, Evelyn, you would have doubted yourself. You would have wondered if you deserved any of it, if you were really James's daughter, if you had the right to claim your inheritance." She leaned forward, her eyes intense despite her obvious exhaustion. "So I built you something better than evidence. I built you a journey. I enlisted Beverly 2 years before my death, asking her to do something that went against every instinct she had, to seduce my husband, to play a role, to document his crimes while pretending to love him. She did it out of friendship to me, and out of belief that you deserved protection. I encoded the recipe book instead of just showing you bank statements because I knew you'd need to solve puzzles to prove to yourself that you were smart enough, strategic enough. I left you breadcrumbs instead of a map because you needed to walk this path yourself, with allies you chose using the kindness and intelligence that are truly your inheritance from both me and your father. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I couldn't look away from the screen. They needed to reveal their true characters. Eleanor continued, her voice stronger now despite her physical weakness. Richard needed to show you who he really was when he thought no one was watching. Valerie needed to demonstrate what fear and weakness looked like when they consumed someone. Kurt needed to expose himself as the predator he'd always been. And you, my darling girl, you needed to discover your own strength. Not the strength I told you that you had, but the strength you proved to yourself by surviving their cruelty and choosing grace anyway. She smiled then, that knowing smile I remembered from childhood, when she'd watch me figure out a difficult math problem on my own instead of just giving me the answer. Every piece I left you, the letter at the restaurant, the cedar chest, the recipe book, Beverly's recordings, they were weapons, yes. But more importantly, they were mirrors. They showed you who you really are, strategic like me, compassionate like your father, strong enough to be kind even when kindness isn't easy. That's the real inheritance, Evelyn, not the money, not the property, the knowledge that you can face cruelty and choose something better. My mother took another labored breath, and I could see the effort it cost her to continue recording. Now I mentioned a witness. There's someone who has watched over you since you were a baby, someone who knew your father well and promised to protect his legacy. She's been in the background of your life, always watching, waiting for the moment you needed her most. My heart began to race. I thought of the woman in the gray coat, the one whose posture reminded me so painfully of my mother, the one who'd appeared at crucial moments. Her name is Margaret Chen Hart, Eleanor said, and the world tilted. Marge Thompson is a pseudonym. She's your father's sister, your aunt. She's been hiding in plain sight for 46 years. Marge. Kind, wise Marge, who'd shown me photographs of my father, who'd kept records of town council meetings, who'd collected petition signatures, who'd preserved the original property deed. Marge was family. After James died, Eleanor explained, the developers who wanted the Heartland became aggressive. They pressured the family, offered money, made threats. Margaret refused to sell. She was only 24 years old, fresh out of law school, and these men were powerful. They made her life hell, vandalized. Her car spread rumors about her, even broke into her apartment. So she did what she had to do. She changed her name to Marge Thompson, moved into a modest house on the other side of town, and went underground. She became invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. And from that invisibility, she protected your father's legacy and waited for you to be old enough to claim it. Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion now. She and I became friends when you were just a baby. She'd come by the house, play with you, watch you grow. We never told anyone the truth because we couldn't risk the developers finding out that a Hart family member was still in town. Margaret watched over you your whole life, Evelyn. Every school play, every milestone, every moment of hurt, she was there, documenting, protecting, waiting for the day I'd be gone. And you'd need someone who knew the whole truth. The video showed Eleanor wiping tears from her own eyes, her hands trembling with the effort. She'll explain everything I couldn't, my mother said. She has photos of James that I could never show you, stories about your father, from someone who grew up with him, love that she's been holding in reserve for 46 years. Go to her, sweetheart. She has so much to share with you, and tell her thank you from me for keeping her promise. Eleanor sat back in her chair, looking exhausted but peaceful. The kitchen behind her was filled with afternoon light, and I remembered that light remembered sitting at that table doing homework while she made dinner. I don't know when I'll truly leave this earth, she said softly. Maybe I've already gone by the time you're seeing this. Maybe I've been gone for months or years. But I need you to know something, Evelyn. Every hard moment you've faced, every kindness you've shown, every time you chose grace over cruelty, I have been so proud of you. So impossibly, overwhelmingly proud. Her voice broke, and she took a moment to compose herself. You are your father's daughter in the best ways, his compassion, his vision, his unshakable belief that community matters more than personal gain. He used to say that a town without generosity was just a collection of buildings, not a real home. You've proven that belief true. And you're my daughter too, strategic, resilient, capable of using your gifts to protect others rather than just yourself. You learned to fight without becoming cruel. That's the hardest thing in the world, baby girl. Eleanor leaned toward the camera, and I felt like she was looking directly at me across the distance of years and death. The recipe book taught you one thing: when they mock you with bread, feed them truth. But the real lesson is simpler and harder. Feed others what you wish the world had fed you. Love, dignity, respect, belonging. You did that at the leftovers worth serving dinner in a way that made me weep when Beverly told me you were planning it. You gave homeless families lobster while serving your abusers the scraps they'd prescribed for your son. You showed them what justice looks like when it's tempered with wisdom. She smiled through her tears. Keep serving that, Evelyn. Always. Feed people the feast they deserve, not the leftovers they've been told to accept. That's how we change the world, one meal, one kindness, one act of dignity at a time. The video began to fade, but I heard her voice one last time, softer now. I love you, my darling girl. I'm so sorry I couldn't stay longer. But I'm not really gone. I'm in every recipe you cook, every kind choice you make, every time you see someone hungry and give them more than they asked for. That's how we live forever in the love we leave behind. The screen went black. I sat in the darkness of my living room, tears streaming down my face, my body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know I could contain that much grief. But mixed with the grief was something else: gratitude, awe, and a profound understanding of how much my mother had loved me. She'd spent her final years orchestrating my protection, my victory, my inheritance of something more valuable than money. I don't remember grabbing my keys or locking the door or driving across town. I must have, because suddenly I was pulling up in front of Marge's house, the porch light glowing in the darkness. It was past midnight, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't spend another moment not knowing the whole truth. I knocked softly, then harder when there was no immediate answer. After a moment, the door opened and Marge stood there in a robe, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her face startled but not surprised. And for the first time I saw it clearly. The Hart family cheekbones that I'd seen in photographs of my father. The same keen, intelligent eyes. The way she held herself straight and proud despite her age. She wasn't just someone who knew my father. She was family. Aunt Margaret, I whispered, my voice breaking on the words. Marge's eyes filled with tears and she opened her arms. Come in, sweetheart, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I've been waiting to tell you everything. Marge's living room was exactly as I remembered it from my previous visit, photographs covering every wall documenting decades of Hartsville history. But now I saw them differently. These weren't just the collection of a local history enthusiast. They were family archives carefully preserved by someone who'd been forced to hide her connection to them. She made tea with the practiced ease of someone who'd comforted many people over many years, and we sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd first shown me pictures of my father. Now I understood why her eyes had been so full of emotion that day. I was 16 when James died. Marge began, her hands wrapped around her mug. Just a kid, really. He was my big brother, 14 years older, and I adored him. When your mother told our family she was pregnant, I was so excited to be an aunt. But then the scaffolding collapsed and James was gone and everything fell apart. Her voice caught, and I realized she was still grieving him even after 46 years. The developers came almost immediately. They'd been after the lakefront property for years, but James had always refused to sell. With him gone and your mother pregnant and alone, they saw an opportunity. They made offers, big offers. Our parents were elderly, scared, vulnerable. I was just a teenager, but I knew what James would have wanted. I said no. She took a sip of tea, gathering herself. That's when the harassment started. Someone slashed my tires. I got threatening phone calls at all hours. They broke into my apartment when I was at law school, didn't take anything, just left. Everything destroyed, so I'd know they'd been there. The message was clear: sell the land or face consequences. I felt a chill run through me. My aunt had been terrorized while trying to protect my father's legacy. So I disappeared, Marge continued. Changed my name legally to Margaret Thompson, started using Marge instead of Margaret, moved to a different part of town, took a job as a paralegal instead of practicing law where I'd be visible. I made myself ordinary, forgettable. And from that invisibility, I watched over the land, attended every town council meeting, documented everything. When your mother married Richard and you were born, Eleanor and I became friends. She figured out who I was within a year. She was too smart not to notice the way I looked at you, the way I always showed up when Hart family matters came up. We never told anyone, not even you, because we couldn't risk the developers finding out a Hart was still in town. Tears were streaming down both our faces now. I watched you grow up, Evelyn. Every school play, every piano recital, every moment Richard made you feel small. I wanted to intervene so many times, but your mother said we had to wait until you were strong enough to fight your own battles. She was right. If I'd stepped in earlier, you would have questioned whether you deserved any of it. You needed to prove to yourself what I already knew, that you're every bit your father's daughter. I reached across the table and took her hands. You've been protecting me my whole life. It's what family does, she said simply, even when that family has to stay hidden. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of settling and unsettling. I had an aunt. I had family beyond the broken relationships I'd always known. Marge and I began having weekly dinners, and she filled in gaps in my knowledge about my father, that my mother couldn't have known: his terrible singing voice, his habit of leaving books half-read all over the house, his absolute conviction that every person deserved dignity regardless of their circumstances. One afternoon, about a month after learning Marge's identity, I met Valerie at a coffee shop she'd suggested. I almost didn't recognize her when she walked in. She'd lost weight, but in a healthy way, and her face had a clarity I'd never seen before. She wasn't wearing the designer clothes and heavy jewelry that had been her uniform for years. Instead, she wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. We ordered coffee, made awkward small talk, and then Valerie took a deep breath. "I've been in counseling for 6 months," she said. "Twice a week. My therapist helped me understand that I spent my whole life competing with you for scraps of approval from a man who wasn't even your real father. I was so busy being jealous, so consumed with resentment, that I never saw what you actually had. Not money or status or Dad's attention, integrity. You had integrity and I had nothing but anger." Her voice was steady now, more coherent than the drunken confession at my hotel room months ago. "I'm not asking for your friendship or trust. I know I destroyed any right to those, but I want you to know I'm changing. The divorce from Kurt is final. I'm living in a small apartment. I've been working as a cook at the community center. It started as community service hours, but I've kept going even after I completed the requirement. And I'm teaching cooking classes twice a week for domestic abuse survivors through the Hart Foundation." That surprised me. I didn't know about the classes. I asked Beverly not to tell you. I didn't want you to think I was doing it for credit or recognition. I'm doing it because those women remind me of who I was, trapped, scared, making terrible choices, because I couldn't see any other way out. If I can help even one person avoid the path I took, maybe I can start to forgive myself. I studied my sister's face, looking for manipulation or performance, but all I saw was exhaustion and genuine remorse. "I'm glad you're healing, Val," I said carefully. "I mean that. We may never be close. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you again, but we can be civil. We can work together for the foundation, and who knows, maybe someday we'll be more than that." Valerie nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." Later that week, Beverly came to my house with a serious expression. We sat in my living room while Luke did homework upstairs, and she pulled out a formal job offer letter. The Hart Foundation board voted unanimously to offer me the position of executive director, she said, not meeting my eyes. It's a paid position, full benefits, managing all the programs and initiatives, but Evelyn, I'm not sure I should accept it." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Because I wasn't truthful with Richard. I know it was for good reasons. I know your mother asked me to do it, but I still spent 2 years lying to a man, manipulating him, pretending to care about him. That's not exactly executive director material." I almost laughed. "Beverly, you spent 2 years of your life protecting me from the shadows. You documented crimes, gathered evidence, put yourself at risk because my mother asked you to help her daughter. You earned this position through loyalty and sacrifice. And besides, we need someone who knows how to run a long con against corruption." Beverly finally looked up, a smile breaking through her serious expression. "When you put it that way, plus you're already doing the job anyway, we're just finally paying you what you're worth." I pushed the offer letter back toward her. "Say yes, please. This foundation needs you. I need you." Beverly signed the letter right there, and we celebrated with wine that probably cost too much but felt necessary. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "You know what we've built here, right?" she said. "You, me, Gwen, Marge, Luke, we're family. Not the family you were born into, but the family you chose. That's what your mother wanted for you all along." She was right. Richard was slowly, tentatively earning his way back towards something like reconciliation. But these women, Beverly, Gwen, Marge, and Luke, they were my core. They were the people who'd fought beside me, who'd protected me, who'd believed in me when I couldn't quite believe in myself. 2 days later, a formal envelope arrived, embossed with the town seal. Inside was an invitation written in elaborate calligraphy. "The town council requests the honor of your presence at a special ceremony dedicating the lakefront park in perpetuity as the James Nathaniel Hart Memorial Commons. We also wish to present you with the town's highest civilian honor, the key to the city. Please join us Saturday at 2 p.m. Luke read it over my shoulder and grinned, his whole face lighting up with excitement. "Mom, you're going to be famous." I pulled him close, thinking about my mother's words about feeding people what they deserve, about kindness as the only weapon that matters. "No, baby," I said softly, smiling at his enthusiasm. "I'm going to be useful. There's a difference." That Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect Texas weather that feels like a gift: warm sunshine, clear blue skies, and a gentle breeze off the lake that carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming wildflowers. Luke and I arrived at the lakefront an hour early to help with final preparations, but the volunteers had everything under control. Beverly was everywhere at once, clipboard in hand, directing caterers and sound technicians with the efficiency of someone who'd planned 1,000 events, which I suppose between the two of us we had. By 2 o'clock, hundreds of people had gathered at what was now officially the James Nathaniel Hart Memorial Commons. The transformation was stunning. What had once been neglected public land threatened by development was now beautifully landscaped with native plants and trees. Wide walking trails meandered along the water's edge. A new playground echoed with children's laughter. Picnic tables dotted the grass under shade trees. And at the center stood a new community pavilion, its wooden beams still smelling of fresh cedar. The dedication ceremony took place on a temporary stage near the water. Mayor Rodriguez spoke first, thanking the community for supporting the preservation effort and acknowledging the courageous stand taken by Evelyn Hart to protect her father's vision. Then came representatives from the Historical Society, from the Environmental Coalition, from the families who used the park regularly. Each speaker emphasized the same theme, that public spaces belong to everyone, that a community thrives when no one is excluded. When Marge stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd. Many knew her as the quiet woman who attended every town council meeting, who'd lived in Hartsville for decades, who kept to herself. No one knew the truth. "My name is Margaret Chen Hart," she began, and I heard gasps ripple through the audience. "I was born a Hart sister to James Nathaniel Hart, the man we honor today. For 46 years I've lived under a different name, hidden in plain sight, protecting the legacy my brother left behind. Today, I'm reclaiming my identity and my family. This land was my brother's dream, that every person, regardless of wealth or status, would have a place to gather, to play, to belong. His daughter Evelyn has ensured that dream lives on. James would be so proud of her. I know I am." She looked directly at me, then tears streaming down her weathered face, and held out her hand. I walked onto the stage and took it, and the crowd rose in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the trees. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze plaque mounted on a stone monument near the pavilion. Luke and I pulled the covering away together, revealing words that would outlast all of us. "This land is held in public trust forever, ensuring that all families, regardless of means, can find peace, joy, and belonging here. Established, 1979, by James Nathaniel Hart. Protected 2024 by his daughter Evelyn Hart." Then came the feast. I'd been planning it for weeks, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. We'd called it the second feast where everyone belongs. And I'd meant every word. There were no assigned seats, no VIP sections, no hierarchies. Families from every part of Hartsville brought dishes to share casseroles and desserts, tamales and fried chicken, homemade bread, and fruit salads. The Hart Foundation supplemented with professionally catered stations offering everything from barbecue to vegetarian options to a dessert bar that made children's eyes go wide. And everyone came. The mayor sat at a picnic table with a family from the homeless shelter discussing the upcoming school year. Business owners who'd initially supported the resort development sat beside environmental activists who'd fought against it, finding common ground over potato salad. Foster children played tag with kids from wealthy families, all of them just children in that moment, all of them belonging. I moved through the crowd with Luke at my side, stopping at every table, thanking people for coming, listening to their stories. A grandmother told me about teaching her granddaughter to fish off the dock her own father had built 40 years ago. A young couple showed me their wedding photos taken at this very spot last month. A veteran in a wheelchair thanked me for making sure the new trails were accessible. At one point, I noticed Valerie working at one of the serving stations. She'd shown up quietly wearing a Hart Foundation volunteer shirt and had immediately started ladling soup into bowls for a long line of people. She worked with focused intensity, making sure each bowl was filled generously, adding extra bread when she thought someone looked particularly hungry. Our eyes met across the pavilion. She paused, ladle in hand, and something passed between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. She nodded, just barely. I nodded back. It was progress. Beverly found me around 4 o'clock as the initial rush of eating was settling into the comfortable buzz of satisfied conversation. "You need to say something," she whispered. "People are waiting." I hadn't prepared a speech. I'd spent so much energy planning the logistics that I hadn't thought about what I'd actually say. But as I walked to the microphone at the pavilion's edge, the words came. "Can I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" I called out, and the crowd gradually quieted, turning toward me. "I want to tell you a story. Almost a year ago, I took my son to a Thanksgiving dinner at an expensive restaurant. During that meal, my family told Luke that he only deserved leftovers because he was adopted. They said he wasn't good enough for the feast." The crowd was completely silent now. Luke stood beside me and I put my arm around his shoulders. That night broke something in me, but it also built something. It made me realize that leftovers aren't about the food, they're about who decides who deserves dignity. For too long, some people have gotten to decide that others deserve less. Less respect, less opportunity, less belonging. Today, we're declaring that's over. Everyone deserves the feast. Every single person, regardless of where they came from, what they look like, how much money they have, or whether they were born into a family or chosen by one, everyone deserves to belong. I gestured to the land around us, to the pavilion, to the people gathered. This land, these programs, this community we're building, it's all founded on that simple truth. My father understood it 46 years ago when he put this property in public trust. My mother understood it when she taught me that kindness is the only weapon worth wielding. And I'm learning it every day from people like you who show up, who share what you have, who make room at the table for everyone. My voice caught and I took a breath. Thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching me that the family we choose can be just as powerful as the family we're born into. Thank you for showing Luke that he doesn't just deserve leftovers, he deserves the whole feast. And so do you. All of you. The applause started slowly, then built like a wave, people rising to their feet, the sound washing over me like a benediction. Luke hugged me tight, and I saw tears in his eyes. Beverly was crying openly. Gwen was grinning and wiping her face. Marge stood with her hands over her heart. And at the edge of the crowd, almost hidden in the shadow of an oak tree, stood Richard. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He was just standing there, tears running down his weathered face, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like he finally understood what he'd almost destroyed. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the water, the crowd slowly dispersed. Volunteers started cleaning up, packing away, serving dishes, breaking down tables. I was helping fold tablecloths when a young woman approached me nervously. She was wearing a Heart Foundation volunteer shirt and couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. "Ms. Hart?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Sarah. I was in foster care until I aged out last year. I lived in 7 different homes before I turned 18. The Foundation Scholarship Program is sending me to college in the fall. I'm going to study social work. I wanted to say thank you. You changed my life." I dropped the tablecloth and pulled her into a hug, overwhelmed by the reality of what we'd built. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was Sarah, a real person whose future had been changed by the foundation my parents had made possible. "You're going to help so many people," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." As we pulled apart, Sarah suddenly remembered something. "Oh, and someone left this for you. A woman in a gray coat. She said to give it to you after the ceremony." She handed me a manila envelope unmarked except for a single word written in black marker: "Private." My hands trembled as I took it, and I watched the gray coat disappear into the parking lot, just as the sun touched the horizon. I never opened that envelope. Something told me to wait, that whatever was inside would make more sense at the right time. So I tucked it into the safe in my home office alongside my mother's recipe book and the other documents that had changed my life, and I let time do what time does best: move forward. 3 years passed in what felt like both a lifetime and a blink. It's now 2027, and I'm sitting in the James and Eleanor Hart Community Center for our monthly Legacy Board meeting, looking around the table at faces that have become my family in ways I never could have predicted that Thanksgiving night in 2024. Luke is 15 now, tall and confident in a way that still catches me off guard sometimes. He's sitting in one of the visitor chairs along the wall doing homework while we conduct foundation business, but I know he's listening. He's always listening. Last month, he spoke at a foster care advocacy event as a Heart Foundation youth ambassador, telling his story to a room full of potential donors and policymakers. He talked about being adopted at 3, about being told he deserved leftovers, and about learning that family is something you build, not something you're simply given. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when he finished, and we raised an additional $200,000 that night. The foundation itself has grown beyond anything I imagined possible. We now fund 50 college scholarships annually for foster and adopted youth, providing not just tuition, but also housing stipends, mentorship, and mental health support. We run 3 domestic violence safe houses across the county, giving women and children a secure place to rebuild their lives. Our community kitchen serves 200 meals every single day, staffed by volunteers and overseen by someone I never thought I'd work alongside. Beverly sits across from me at the conference table, reading through financial reports with the same meticulous attention to detail she once used to document Richard's crimes. As executive director, she's transformed the foundation from a well-meaning charity into a professionally run organization that actually changes lives. She's wearing reading glasses now, her hair has more gray than brown, but she's never seemed more vital, more purposeful. Gwen is beside her, serving as the foundation's legal counsel and as a member of our board of directors. She left private practice 2 years ago to work with us full-time, saying she'd rather spend her days helping people than billing hours. Her legal expertise has been invaluable as we've navigated the complexities of expanding our programs while staying true to our mission. Marge Aunt Margaret, though I still sometimes slip and call her by the name she used for 46 years, runs our historical preservation programs. She's created an entire curriculum about James Nathaniel Hart's vision for public land, and she teaches classes at the community college about the importance of civic engagement. At 75, she's busier than people half her age, and she loves every minute of it. The other 3 seats at our table rotate among community members who benefit from our programs. This month, we have Jamal, a former foster youth who's now studying law on one of our scholarships. Beside him is Patricia, a domestic violence survivor who went through our Safe House program and now volunteers there helping other women find their strength. And Marcus, who sits next to me and occasionally touches my hand under the table when he thinks no one's looking. Marcus teaches high school English coaches debate and has the kind of steady kindness that doesn't need to announce itself. We've been dating for 8 months, taking things slowly because both of us have been hurt before and both of us have children to consider. Luke adores him. That's what matters most. The Legacy Board itself was formally established 18 months ago, creating a permanent governance structure designed to outlast any individual. 7 seats total. Evelyn Hart as president. Though I've made it clear I won't hold that position forever. Beverly as executive director. Gwen as legal counsel. Marge as historian. And 3 rotating community seats elected by foundation beneficiaries. 1 always held by a current or former foster youth. 1 reserved for a domestic violence survivor, and 1 open to any community member who's benefited from our programs. Our mission statement is displayed on the wall behind me, words we spent months crafting. We exist to ensure that no person, regardless of their origin, circumstances, or past, is ever told they deserve leftovers when they deserve the feast. Every meeting begins with someone reading it aloud. Today it's Patricia's turn, and her voice catches on the word leftovers because she knows what it means to be told you deserve less. We meet here in the James and Eleanor Hart Community Center, a building that once housed the town records office before Kurt burned it down. We rebuilt it, expanded it, and filled it with purpose. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The place Kurt tried to destroy through arson is now the headquarters for everything he tried to prevent. Richard volunteers here twice a week, working at the food bank on the building's ground floor. At 71, he's slower than he used to be, his heart condition managed but ever present. He's established what he calls a second chance program for elderly people who made serious financial mistakes, offering free financial counseling and helping them rebuild. He never mentions that he's one of them, that he's teaching from experience, but everyone knows. He and Beverly have maintained their unusual friendship. She provides structure and accountability. He provides financial advice earned through painful lessons. And together they've helped dozens of seniors avoid the traps he once fell into. Valerie isn't on the board, but she's part of our ecosystem. She's been sober for 3 years, attending AA meetings religiously, and she's become the head chef of our community kitchen. Last year, she published a cookbook called Recipes for Redemption, filled with affordable, nutritious meals, and interspersed with short essays about her journey from abuse and addiction to recovery. All proceeds go to the foundation. We have lunch once a month, the 2 of us at a small diner neither of us has any history with. We talk about her cooking classes, about Luke's soccer games, about the weather. Sometimes we talk about our mother. It's not the sister relationship I once hoped for, but it's real. And it's slowly building towards something that might one day look like trust. My event planning business has thrived in unexpected ways. After the trial and the public attention, I expected to lose clients who'd want to distance themselves from drama. Instead, I've been booked solid for 3 years. Apparently, people want to hire the woman with integrity, as one bride put it. I've learned to balance the business with foundation work, giving each the attention it deserves, but never letting either consume me entirely. Okay, last item on the agenda, Beverly says, pulling my attention back to the meeting. Evelyn has a proposal. I stand moving to the front of the room where I've set up a presentation board with architectural drawings and photographs. I want to create an archive room in this building, a permanent exhibit documenting what we're calling the struggle. Everything that happened from that Thanksgiving dinner to Kurt's conviction and beyond. I point to the materials I've arranged: photographs of my mother's recipe book, transcripts from the trial, copies of the legal document stills from the security footage of the Thanksgiving dinner, images from the leftovers worth serving event. Future generations should understand that change doesn't come easy, I continue. They should see how my mother planned for years documenting crimes and recipe margins, because that was the safest place to hide truth. They should see how we fought legally and ethically, how we chose restoration over revenge. They should understand that this foundation exists because people were willing to be strategic and patient and kind even when kindness wasn't easy. This is our history. It deserves to be preserved and studied. The room is silent as everyone absorbs the proposal. Then Marge speaks up, her voice thoughtful. We should dedicate the archive on the anniversary of the original Thanksgiving dinner. Make it a full-circle moment. That's when everything started. We should mark that date every year, turn it from a day of humiliation into a day of remembrance and gratitude. Heads nod around the table. Gwen starts making notes about legal requirements for archiving sensitive documents. Beverly begins calculating costs. Marcus squeezes my hand, proud of the idea. We're deep in discussion about timelines and design when Luke suddenly appears in the doorway of the conference room, his face flushed like he's been running. Mom, he says, slightly out of breath. There's someone here to see you. She says she knew Grandma Eleanor and has something important to give you. My heart stops. For 3 years I've kept that envelope unopened, waiting. And now, on the day we're planning to memorialize our history, someone appears with something more. Did she give a name? I ask, already knowing the answer will be complicated. Luke shakes his head. She just said you'd understand when you saw her. She's waiting in the lobby. I excused myself from the meeting and walked down the hallway to our lobby, my heart pounding with that strange mixture of anticipation and dread that comes when the past reaches forward to touch the present. Standing near the reception desk was an elderly black woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She held a wooden box against her chest like it was precious cargo. Ms. Hart, she said, her voice gentle. My name is Ruth Washington. I was a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, where your mother spent her final weeks. She asked me to do something for her, and I've been waiting for the right time. We moved to a quiet corner of the lobby, and Ruth set the box on a table between us. It was cedar, beautifully crafted, with Eleanor Hart's initials carved into the lid. Your mother gave this to me 3 days before she died, Ruth explained. She was very specific about the instructions. She said, wait 5 years after my death, then find my daughter Evelyn and give her this. She'll need time to become who she's meant to be first. I've been following your story through the news, watching the foundation grow, waiting for the moment that felt right. When I saw the announcement about the archive dedication on the anniversary of that Thanksgiving dinner, I knew it was time. My hands shook as I opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each one labeled in my mother's handwriting. For Evelyn's 50th birthday. For Luke's high school graduation. For the day you fall in love again. For when you feel like giving up. For your proudest moment. Each envelope was sealed, waiting for moments my mother would never witness but had somehow anticipated. Beneath the letters was a photograph I'd never seen before, professionally restored and framed. It showed my mother and James Hart, both impossibly young, sitting by the lake, with my mother's pregnant belly visible beneath a summer dress. They were laughing at something off camera, their faces radiant with joy and love. This was what happiness looked like before grief found it. And at the bottom of the box was a single recipe card, newer than the others, written in my mother's increasingly shaky final handwriting. The title read, Leftovers Worth Serving. I read it aloud, my voice breaking. Ingredients: 1 cup of courage, 2 tablespoons of truth, a generous portion of mercy, and unlimited love. Instructions: mix thoroughly with community. Serve warm to anyone who's hungry, body, mind, or soul. Serves everyone. Always. Ruth touched my hand gently. She wanted you to have this when you were ready to understand what it meant. I think that time is now. I thanked Ruth, held the box close, and returned to the board meeting where my family was waiting. When I showed them what Ruth had brought when I read that final recipe aloud, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. 2 years passed between that moment and now. 2 years of continuing to build, to serve, to transform leftovers into feasts. And tonight, on the 5th anniversary of that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything, over 500 people have gathered at the Lakefront Pavilion for what has become our most cherished annual tradition. Luke is 17 now, nearly as tall as Marcus, his voice deeper, but his heart still tender. He stands at the microphone in front of the crowd, no longer the scared 12-year-old who had his dignity questioned at a restaurant table. He's become a powerful speaker, a Heart Foundation youth ambassador who uses his story to help others claim their own worth. 5 years ago. Luke begins, his voice carrying across the pavilion. My aunt told me I only deserved leftovers because I was adopted. She said I wasn't really part of the family, and for a moment I believed her. But my mom taught me something that night that changed how I see the world. She taught me that family isn't about biology or paperwork or who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up. It's about who chooses you and keeps choosing you every single day. He pauses, looking at me with such love and pride that I have to bite my lip to keep from crying. This dinner isn't just about food, he continues. It's about taking what the world calls worthless and showing that nothing is worthless when you treat it with dignity. Tonight, people brought ingredients they would have thrown away, vegetable scraps, day-old bread, bruised fruit, and our volunteer chefs turned them into this incredible meal we're about to share. That's what community does. It transforms, it redeems. It makes the leftover into the feast. The crowd applauds, and I watch Valerie in the kitchen area, tears streaming down her face as she stirs a pot of soup made from ingredients that would have been garbage this morning. She's been sober for 5 years now, her cookbook has sold 20,000 copies, and she's become one of our most dedicated volunteers. We have lunch every week now, not just once a month, and last week she told me she's started thinking of me as her sister again. Not yet, I'd said, but maybe soon. Richard sits at a table near the front, Beverly on one side and Marcus on the other. He's 73 now, his heart condition requiring careful management, but he's here. He volunteers 4 days a week instead of 2 because, as he told me last month, I don't have time to waste anymore. When Luke finishes speaking, Richard asks for the microphone and Luke helps him stand. 5 years ago. Richard says, his voice wavering with age but strong with conviction. I was a small man who cared about small things, power, status, money, the validation of people who didn't matter. I let jealousy poison me for 40 years, and I hurt the people I should have protected. This woman, he gestures to me, my daughter taught me that legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you give. It's what you build when no one's watching. It's how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from being kind. He sits down heavily, and Beverly squeezes his hand. The crowd is silent, moved by his honesty. As the sun begins to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and rose, I gather my core family: Luke, Beverly, Gwen, Marge, Valerie, Richard, Marcus, and several foundation scholars, including Sarah, now in her senior year, studying social work. We form a circle near the water's edge, and I pull out my mother's final recipe card. Mom spent her last years making sure I'd have what I needed, I say, my voice carrying to those nearby who've grown quiet to listen. Not money or property, but something better. She gave me a map to my own strength. She showed me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the most powerful force there is. So tonight, I want to honor her by making a promise. I look at each face in the circle, young and old, blood family and chosen family, people who've known me forever and people I've only recently met. As long as I live, I will keep serving this meal. Not food, though we'll do that too. But dignity, respect, and belonging. To anyone who's ever been told they're not good enough, or they deserve less, or they don't belong, you deserve the whole feast. Every single bite. And there's always room at this table. We embrace this family I've built from ruins and grace. Valerie cries into my shoulder, whispering, "I'm sorry," for the 1,000th time, and I whisper back, "I know, because that's all either of us needs right now." Marge holds both of us 3 generations of heart women finding our way back to each other. Luke wraps his arms around me from behind his chin, resting on my shoulder, the way it did when he was small enough to carry. "What should we serve next year, Mom?" he asks, and I hear the echo of that question from 5 years ago when he was 12 and scared and trying to be brave. I smile through my tears, looking out at the lakefront filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, laughing and eating and belonging to something bigger than themselves. Lights twinkle in the pavilion. Children play at the water's edge despite the evening chill. The bronze plaque bearing my father's name gleams in the lamplight, a permanent reminder of why we do this work. "Whatever people need, baby," I say softly. "Whatever people need." As the celebration continues behind us, Luke and I walk hand in hand toward the water. The crowd noise fades to a gentle hum, and I hear my mother's voice in my memory, or maybe in the wind, or maybe in that place where love goes when people die. Wherever it is, her words surround us. Feed others what you wish the world had fed you. The sun touches the horizon, turning the lake into liquid gold. Luke leans against me, this boy who became my son through choice rather than chance. This young man who understands that the best families are built, not born. "Mom," he says quietly, "do you think Grandma Eleanor would be proud of what we built?" I pull him close, breathing in the moment, the smell of the lake, the sound of community, the feeling of having survived something terrible and created something beautiful on the other side. "I think she already knew we would," I whisper. "That's why she left us the recipe." We stand there together, mother and son, as the sun sets on another year of choosing grace over cruelty, of serving feasts instead of leftovers, of proving that the family we build can be just as powerful as the family we're born into. Behind us, the celebration continues, people eating, laughing, belonging. And ahead of us, the water reflects the last light of day, and tomorrow and all the tomorrows we'll keep choosing kindness, one meal at a time. And that's where Evelyn's story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. 5 years after that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner, she didn't just survive, she transformed cruelty into community leftovers, into legacy, and pain into purpose. Her mother's recipe wasn't just about food. It was about feeding people what they deserve: dignity, respect, and belonging. Evelyn learned that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so beautiful that it outlasts the hurt. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you deserved less? Have you ever been treated like you weren't good enough, like you didn't belong at the table? Maybe it was family. Maybe it was someone you trusted. Maybe it was a moment that changed how you saw yourself. Evelyn's story reminds us that we don't have to accept that narrative. We can choose grace without choosing to be weak. We can set boundaries without losing our kindness. And most importantly, we can build families, real families from the people who choose us, not just the people who share our blood. If this story moved you, if Evelyn's journey resonated with something in your own life, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below, telling me what part of this story spoke to you most. Was it Evelyn's quiet strength, her mother's strategic brilliance, the way Richard finally learned accountability, or maybe it was Luke's wisdom about being double lucky because 2 mothers chose him? Your stories matter to me, and I read every single comment. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people who face extraordinary challenges with grace and courage, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week I share true stories that remind us what's possible when we refuse to become bitter, even when life gives us every reason to be. Hit that like button if Evelyn's story inspired you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they deserve the whole feast, not just the leftovers. Thank you for listening to Evelyn's story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, kindness isn't weakness. It's the most powerful weapon you'll ever wield. Until next time, keep serving the feast. Keep